Yes. Thanks. All right. Thanks for joining us. Great day today to everybody. Happy Monday. And today is April 11th, 2022, and this is the Aspen City Council work session. Today on our agenda, we have two items. We are starting with our, hang on a second. Where do I want to be? All right. For April 11th today, we are talking about two items: housing, our council goal, and Burlingame 3, Phase 3, affordable housing unit sales. And then we also have a short-term rental policy discussion after that. So we'll start with our first agenda item. Chris, happy Monday.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor, members of council. My name is Chris Everson, Affordable Housing Development Project Manager with the City of Aspen. We're here to talk about the income distribution and sales process for the Burlingame Ranch Phase 3 Affordable Housing Development. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, if that's okay.
Go right ahead.
So today's request is can council agree to the recommended or some modified version of the income category distribution for the project? Does council agree to the use of the APSHA lottery process for the sales of the units with the recommended requirements or some modified set of requirements? So back in the fall at our budget work session, we had talked about the 2022 work plan for Burlingame Ranch Phase 3 for this year. And today we're going to be focusing on what was the first two items on that list. That is determining the income category distribution, defining the sales process. We have started to get inquiries from folks throughout the community about what the sales process is going to look like and what they can expect in terms of timing. And so for us to establish this information will help us to disseminate that information out to folks in the community so that they know what to expect as soon as possible. So in order to determine a recommended income category distribution for the 79 for-sale units at Burlingame Ranch Phase 3, we looked at four different sources of information. Each source of information has some imperfection to it, and using only one would limit our opportunity to look at the big picture. So did look at four different pieces of information. Those are the as-sold Burlingame Phase 2 income category distribution. One thing that was interesting about the as-sold category distribution for the Burlingame Phase 2 units was that was a reservations process. And we accepted reservations for applicants who brought a qualified application and showed up to the table and placed a $500 refundable deposit. So during the 2-year process of those reservations, there was some turnover, so we had to constantly keep up with the turnover in the reservation process. But in the end, the units got sold to qualified applicants who came through the door. And so it was almost like a real-time experiment in actual for-sale housing demand. On the downside, it's a little bit dated at this time, and so we do want to look at additional information sources. Number two is the past 5 years of APSHA lottery bid data. So the benefits there are looking at specific relevant bid data by actual housing applicants, and not only looking at who won those lotteries, right, but looking at the number of applicants for each lottery, so you can determine the intensity of the demand. The downside of that data is it's limited to what actually came up for resales, right? And so if there was a certain type of household size or unit size that was not represented in that data for one reason or another, we wouldn't be able to see that. It would be sort of a blind spot. We recently did do a market study for the lumberyard project, which did provide us with some for sale housing demand-related information. Provided some information in your packet, and then I've added some additional information beyond what was in your packet just to augment what was in your packet. So we'll see that when we get to it. That's a data-driven study based on the QCEW data that we can get from the state of Colorado at the aggregate level, which is available to us as a municipality, so it's got some detail to it. The downside is, it's difficult to peg sort of absolutes out of that information. It gives us good information about trends and overall, general need, but it doesn't really give us that that experienced data like some of the other information. And then the Aption Development Policy does provide some guidance in terms of what's needed. That's actually split between what's seen as needed from private projects as compared to what's seen as needed from public projects. Benefits there is it's informed by the board, and presumably the Aption board has some knowledge of what's needed in terms of housing. And it's also, the downside there is it's slightly difficult to understand the empirical accuracy of that information and how it was determined. But anyway, all four of those each, has some flaws, and we sort of creating a process to look at all of this information when determining how we're going to recommend the income distribution. Are there any questions on any of that before I move on?
No.
So digging into the Burlingame Ranch Phase 2 as sold income categories, we did have a distribution of units that had, if you make note of this 2-bedroom number here, the Phase 3 distribution is you're gonna see that there's quite a bit fewer 2-bedroom units. When the facility was, designed originally, it was designed holistically in terms of providing numerous different types of product, but it's being delivered slightly differently just based on what happens to be in each building as we go through the process of implementation. So the as sold categories in Burlingame 2 were 33% in the Category 2 bucket, 43% in the Category 3 bucket, 22% in the Category 4 bucket, and we had just 2 sales in the Category 5 bucket, which at the time was 5 and 6 and 7 all separated out. 5 and 6 and 7 have since been combined into a single Category 5. But we didn't have any Category 6 and Category 7 applicants who went through with the reservation process at the time. So the average category is not a very good metric. It's just meant to give us a rough idea of where we're landing. The actual subsidy per FTE there, and we can talk about the issues with using the FTE metric, but just as a baseline to be able to compare Phase 2 to Phase 3, was $135,000 per FTE in terms of the subsidy. So that's the first metric we're sort of looking at, the first information source we're looking at. Want to then sort of move on and dig into the next set of information, which is the past 5 years of lottery bid data. So I've summarized it quite a bit here, and you can see that we get the highest bidding for 1-bedroom units in Categories 3 and 4, which is actually slightly interesting, particularly the 4 might become a point of conversation later on when we get to the recommendation. We see heavy bidding for 1-bedroom units in Category 2, as well as 2 and 3-bedroom units in Category 4. We do see some strong bidding in 2-bedroom units in Category 2, as well as 3-bedroom units in Category 3. We see a fair amount of bidding in all of these areas, including 2-bedroom units in Category 3, 3-bedroom units in Category 2, and some bidding in Category 5. Although not as high as the others, still noteworthy. And so we have these sort of hot spots in the one-bedrooms in Category 3 and 4. And then slightly less hot spots in terms of Category 2 one-bedrooms and Category 4 2 and 3 bedrooms. And then still strong bidding in Category 2 2 bedrooms and Category 3 3 bedrooms. So there's kind of a lot here, but if that makes the point, move on to the next source of information. So this was some information from the lumberyard market study that was done by Economic and Planning Systems earlier this year. I've noticed that folks don't understand my tables, and I apologize. The table on the left is meant to display job growth by area median income in Pitkin County. So it's specific to Pitkin County because under the program, you have to be employed in Pitkin County. We've seen over from 2000, and this is based on 2010 through 2019. Due to COVID, the 2020 and 21 data has been omitted. But over those 9 years, we did see the most job growth in Pitkin County in Category 3, and then followed by Category 2. We see some job growth in Category 4 as well. But interesting that we're really not seeing job growth, particularly in Category 1. On the right-hand side, this graph is meant to show households by area median income in the Roaring Fork Valley. So not job data, household data. The existence of households in these income buckets, if you will. So over those 9 years, the Roaring Fork Valley has seen a loss of some 340 Category 1 households. For one reason or another, those households were there in 2010, less so in 2019. And again, this is valley-wide, mainly because when we create a new affordable housing facility, a lot of times we see roughly half of the applicants being from Down Valley, roughly half from Aspen as well. And it turns out that the market area for our affordable housing developments tends to be a valley-wide market. So that's why in this case we're looking at valley-wide households. Have seen some varying numbers in terms of households in Categories 2, 3, and 4. Some of this has to do with supply up and down the valley. The EPS report did focus heavily on some projects that have enabled supply in those areas. But in particular, you can see that the Category 3 households has increased by less than the 2s and the 4s. But I did add to this slide some additional information that wasn't here before, and that is that the EPS report did recommend in for sale units a income distribution that I'm going to show again when we get to the recommendation slide, and you'll be able to see that it closely matches what we're recommending, but it's not exactly what we're recommending, and we can talk about the differences.
Chris, can I ask a question? On the slide to, well, I guess your one here, just so I understand this data correctly, when I'm looking at, say, Category 1, there are two scenarios, well, there are multiple scenarios, but it could be that that household, for whatever reason, moved down valley or out of the valley and was replaced by a household at a higher income. But it's also possible that they stayed in their home, but their income went up, and they would still be reflected as a negative because they would have moved from column 1 to 2.
That's right, and furthermore, that could mean that they took one of these new Category 2 jobs or even one of these new Category 3 jobs.
Okay, I just want to make sure.
So there's lots of different like movements that could occur to cause those differences. Right?
And then I did have one question on the previous slide. So there's certain, if you go back then, yeah. So for example, I understand that we're doing the look back, and the look back can only take into account things that have actually come up. It's good data. It's just a limitation we know about. But for instance, 2-bedroom Category 4, 64 lottery occurrences. I don't know for sure, but my guess is that that is a higher percentage of lotteries versus the number of two-bedroom Category 4s per the stock. So by chance occurrence, there was just more that came up. And so I'm just wondering, in the recommendation, did we take that into account, right? So there's this sort of aberration of those units that may not happen over the next 5 years, and so the demand may go up for those per unit as a result. Is that kind of baked into the recommendation?
In a way. In fact, two-bedroom Category 4s tend to turn over a lot because it just so happens that in the inventory, there's a lot of them.
Okay.
In fact, there's more two-bedroom Category 4s than anything else. And I'm
Okay.
saying that while I'm quickly glancing at the inventory, so I could be wrong, but it does appear that there's and also, what I'm measuring here, like in this sort of heat map portion,
Yep.
is not the occurrences of the lottery, it's actually the average number of bids that occurs per lottery.
No, that I know.
So that's, just under 30 bids per unit, which is a strong measure of demand.
Got it. So what I'm hearing is that, I mean, I understood the bottom table, but there actually is a really high number of those units, and so 64, while it might a little bit outpace, it largely reflects the makeup, and so we can just take that at face value.
There may be a lot of them, and also people want them.
Turn over that. Cool. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Just to add to that, and there are people who get into some of those Category 4 units and find the HOA dues are too high to maintain there. And so, a number of people I know at Hunter Creek have gotten in and almost within 6 months or a year have said, I've got to sell it. It's too high to maintain it. So there's other reasons why those lotteries come up more frequently.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
So the next source of information is from the APSHA development policy, which says that for public projects, it's most desirable to create 1- and 2-bedroom units in Categories 2 and 3, and 3-bedroom units in Categories 3 and 4. And so you can take a quick glance at the existing inventory here to see where those fall. And so I was quickly looking at this square here, which points to that 198 two-bedroom Category 4 units. So it's not an empirical exercise by any means to try to pull all this together into a recommendation. It's more just looking at the argument for each individual field in the array and understanding whether to add or remove some things around. And so this is the recommended income category distribution for Burlingame Phase 3. First thing I did want to point out here is the lower number of two-bedroom units in this phase. Again, just so happens to have worked out that way based on the project when it was designed years ago. So that's going to have an effect on the overall distribution because those two-bedroom units are almost equally distributed throughout, with 5 two-bedroom units in Category 2, 5 in Category 3, 4 in Category 4, and 3 in Category 5. Similarly, you can look at the 25 one-bedroom units. Those are distributed more heavily on the lower income side, with 8 in Categories 2 and 3, 7 units in Category 4, and 2 in Category 5. And then for the 3-bedroom units, we've got more of those. They're heavily distributed to Categories 3 and 4, less so into Category 3, and again, some in Category 5. With a distribution in Category 2 totaling 20%, and Category 3 being 34%, Category 4 at 32%, and Category 5 at 14%. And I've included down here what that EPS recommendation was, and you can see 23 compared to 20 being recommended here, 34 in Category 3 being recommended equally in both, 26% being recommended by EPS in Category 4, and we're a little heavier than that here. Category 5, 17%, and 14% here. So the average category in this recommended scheme is 3.4. And just as a point of comparison, the subsidy per FTE being $206,000 per FTE. And there was a note in your memo about why with only such a small income category difference would the subsidy be so much higher than it was for Burlingame Phase 2. And that's mainly explained by the fact that construction cost increases at some 5 to 10% on average per year far outpaces the increases in the sales prices in the APSHA regulations, right? So this was the recommended mix. You know, having had a chance to re-look at this, I thought you could make a case to move a couple of 4s, maybe a 5, down into Category 2, if you felt like doing that. Each time I do that, I then go back here and remind myself of this hot spot pretty much throughout Category 4. And so, you know, each move you might want to make, there's an argument for it and then a small argument against it when you're making those onesie, twosie choices. And so, you know, willing to discuss anything like that in terms of, you know, any changes you might want to make. It's, at this point, really not something that's going to move the needle. One thing to mention is that if there aren't enough applicants, for example, at Category 5, and there are second priority bids received at Category 4, Council does have the ability to lower the income categories of the units to fit the applicants, right? So instead of causing a Category 4 person to arbitrarily pay a Category 5 sales price, we could just lower the income category of the unit to meet their income level. So we're at the stage where those choices can still be made throughout the sales process, and were made during the Burlingame Ranch Phase 2 sales process. Any questions or comments on this recommendation?
An hour later.
Now or later. I suppose I would be a little more interested in more units being closer to the Category 2 and 3. You know, a Category 4 unit allows an income of 2 people up to $175,000. I'm not sure what the maximum income is for Category 5, but those are fairly high incomes, and there's already a lot of Category 4 and 5 units out there available for resale as they come on resale. And based on the overall inventory, it seems like we're shorter on the Category 2s and 3s. So that would be a general instinct, but not like that I have a number of 5 here or 2 there or something like that. The one thing I would comment, and you've alluded to it, is I would rather see a subsidy number per bedroom as opposed to FTEs, because, you know, we don't know how many FTEs really live in each bedroom. And, you know, we're always giving credit for 1.25 for a studio or X amount for a 2-bedroom. And yet we don't have the data to say, is that accurate or not? And so I'd rather look at it as a subsidy per bedroom. And if they pack 2 people in that bedroom, great. But it gives me a false sense of the subsidy when we do it that way. I think that I know it's embedded in APSHA code, and it's embedded in our current code in many different areas, but it's just not the metric I want to know for subsidizing the project.
Okay.
Thank you.
In this case, it's really just used as a point of comparison back to
Sure.
the Phase 2. So we can show that 3 different ways, if you like, in terms of FTEs, bedrooms, and units.
Yeah.
And if bedrooms feels like the most meaningful, then, you know, you can look at that. One thing that I do like about using subsidy per FTE does allow us to compare it to the fee in lieu of mitigation numbers, which is a study that we perform that sort of looks at the cost of, or I should say the subsidy related to housing folks at each income level. And it's notable that the subsidy per FTE here is a bit lower than the city's fee in lieu of mitigation, known because the land for this project was procured years and years ago, whereas the fee in lieu of mitigation amounts are meant to be going forward numbers, right?
Right. And, kind of just one other broader comment for ourselves and you and the public. But price on real estate and interest rates have a very clear relationship. And it's one thing for us to say, oh, this unit's going to sell for $175,000. But, you get your 20% down, so you get your best mortgage rate, and you don't have to pay private mortgage insurance. That difference between someone getting a 2.5% mortgage, as we were just seeing, and being a 5% mortgage is a doubling of the interest payment. And so it really comes down to what does that monthly payment equal with HOAs. And so I don't want to set prices and then find out later that if someone has to go to obtain their mortgage to actually buy the property, that their HOA and mortgage payments are going to push them above where their category says they should have for a monthly payment. So, we're just watching rates climb very quickly now. I don't know where they'll be in December when we go to sell or when these people go to acquire their mortgage. But that's a real issue, is how expensive is the money that people are borrowing to put into this project as part of the kind of public-private partnership of it. So I think that's something we might have to really take a look at. And we're not looking at prices on any of these. So we're not saying your category 5 or category 3 2-bedroom will sell for X, and that means a monthly payment of Y, and we're anticipating HOA dues of Z, and so it's just not a full picture for me as it sits. I understand we have to make some decisions going forward, but I'd like to have a better sense of what we will expect future buyers to be able to pay in their category with the interest rate environment.
So one of the things that I was planning to do as part of the marketing communications program is to make some information available for kind of each one of these boxes and say, let's just pick a box, let's say category 3 2-bedroom. So at the category 3 2-bedroom, what would be your mortgage payment at some 3% interest rate, and what would it be at some 4% interest rate, and give you a range of your potential mortgage payment, and then also give you your HOA dues and an estimation of your utilities. So here's an estimation, or a range, I should say, of your monthly payment. So if you happen to be a category 3 2-bedroom person, you can look at that and say, and understand on a monthly basis whether that's affordable to you. And we could break that out for each one of these, different categories and bedroom sizes. So that way people will understand what they're getting into.
And I appreciate that. I guess I'm just wondering if we set our prices today thinking that there's 2.5% or 3% mortgages out there to be had, and we get to where we're at sales time period and interest rates are at 6% for most buyers, that would set different prices in my mind. But I'll let that go for now.
I guess just one question back to you might be, if you're interested in shifting some of these to category 2, how many might that be? Because would it be let me just take a look. If you look down here at this red box, the category 2 recommendation from EPS was 23%. That's going to be a difference of 2 units.
Yeah.
So would you want to exceed that?
No, I'm just looking at that right now. We have 46% of the units are being allocated for people with incomes above $150,000 a year, and it seems like for our workforce development, workforce needs that and the existing inventory. When you pair it with the existing inventory, that seems a little high on that end to me, but I'm only one person.
Yeah, would there be support from the council to redistribute some of the category 4 and some of the category 5 units down to the category 2 level to increase that number, be it 2 units or 2 to 5 units or perhaps even more? Is there anyone who wants to discuss that?
Yeah, I'm interested in looking at that. I'm looking at job generation where it's primarily in the category 3s, and 2 and 3. And the supply of housing, it looks like category 3 and 2 and 3 are the areas where we need them to make up the most. So I would favor moving some from the higher categories to the category 2 and 3, I think particularly in the 1 and 2 bedroom categories.
Skippy?
I think John I was kind of listening to I was comfortable with staff's recommendation, but I'm totally open to it, so I'm just curious what you guys thought.
I appreciate Rachel's logic, and yeah, I'd like to look into it further.
Yeah, I'm supportive. What you said was, we're talking about 2 to 5 units.
Yeah, do you want to try to determine that now? Whether that's, or do you want to just allow us to go ahead and redistribute sort of like a handful of those down to 2 and 3? You know, there's really only an opportunity to move a couple of 1 bedrooms, a couple of 2 bedrooms, but maybe 1 or 2 category.
You know, again, I wasn't
4 or
talking
3
about major
bedrooms?
changes, just a little bit high on that end to me, and get the percentages a little changed up.
Sure.
Yeah,
So what I'm hearing is administratively, you're asking us redistribute, whether it's 2, 3-ish, it's all right, but you want us to up the number of category 2 units available for sale.
2 and 3.
2 and
2
3.
and 3.
Yeah.
Okay, so all right, I see at least 3 heads nodding. Thank you.
And then are there any other guidelines on that, or any other input on that?
Well-
Ward was talking about, you know, specifically in, you were saying 1 and 2 bedroom?
1 and 2, yeah, because of the job generation and what the availability in those areas seem to be.
I'm looking at the 14 units in the category 4, 3-bedroom box in the dead center. I'm just wondering if you might want to keep that 14, or you want to move a couple of those to the left.
Rachel, what's your feeling on that?
Well, I could see moving one of those category 5s over to the left and maybe keep the category 4s the same.
Okay.
You know, and reduce that one by 1. The others would just potentially be any of the 1 bedrooms, but I realize there's a larger balance within the project of total units as well.
Ready to move on?
Yeah,
We can do that administratively, I think, and come up with something that's reasonable.
Yep. Thanks, Chris.
Sure. So we've consulted with APSHA, and the recommendation is to use the lottery process. I talked about the reservation system that we used in the past for Burlingame Phase 2. You know, time is not on our side to do something like that at this point. You have the APSHA lottery process, which is good to have. It's being recommended by APSHA staff to use that. The conditions listed are what's recommended. Of course, satisfying APSHA eligibility requirements, which actually includes number 2, your 2021 tax returns and forms. APSHA fees for qualifying and bidding would apply. The APSHA maximum unit sales prices would apply as well. One thing that's not in the regulations is a pre-qualification letter for a mortgage. APSHA has asked that we include that in the process so that the lottery process, being that we are lotterying 79 units, each time, if we don't include the pre-qualification letter from a mortgage lender as a requirement, when APSHA does their lotteries and then they get the answers to their lotteries and then they go to offer the units to the bidders, if a bidder is not pre-qualified, then that stops the process until the next bidder can be asked if they've been pre-qualified, and so on and so forth. And in order to do 79 lotteries, that can make the process extremely time-consuming and difficult on the other folks who are participating in the lottery as well. So that's why that requirement is included and has been included in the past. It was included in our reservations process for Burlingame Phase 2 as well. The last item on the list is closing fees do include a capital reserve contribution, which seeds the capital reserve fund for the HOA. We then commission a capital reserve study for the facilities and put them on a roadmap, if you will, for their capital improvements over the years. And that the declaration for the new homeowners association will also require them to reach 70% funding of their capital reserve within 7 years. That's the standard we've been using. That's what's been recommended to us. But again, we're not specifically determining that tonight, but the closing fees would include a capital reserve contribution to seed that capital reserve fund for the HOA.
And is that one year, or what is that? And would that be credited to each individual purchase?
It's based on
Unit?
the monthly HOA dues, and it's in addition to your purchase.
And these are you mentioned capital improvements, but the cap reserves are generally for common area repairs that are needed, and so not so much improvements as maintenance, long-term maintenance.
Homeowners associations, especially when you start a new one, you create an operating account and you create a capital reserve account. The capital reserve account is a savings account for your future capital repairs, saving for a new roof, saving for major capital repairs that aren't operational, whereas things like snow removal, your yearly insurance payments, those are going to be operational costs.
Right. Yeah, but these are for those common area, the roofs, et cetera.
Yes.
And again, this is just a seed until a cap reserve study has been done to find out what the annual contribution per unit's going to be.
By the time the units are sold, the capital reserve study will have already been done and will be in place already. So they'll go hand in hand.
And so just so I get it clear in my mind that the closing costs are going to cover projected first year cap reserve.
In addition to the capital reserve contribution that occurs at closing, the owners will begin to pay their monthly HOA dues. A portion of their monthly HOA dues will be a capital reserve contribution, but it'll be a monthly contribution. And so they'll be on their way of contributing year after year after year to the capital reserves.
So this is kind of an ante to be in the game.
It's think of it as a cover charge, but it does get the capital reserve fund seeded for the HOA.
Rachel?
Yeah, thank you. When we get to that point, I'd like to look at whether the city should start the HOA pot as well as a capital reserve pot and not have it start at zero from the closing costs, which are kind of high and hard for people to get into to begin with. But that's a separate conversation. I just think it's not right to start them off with zero. My bigger issue is not on the board, but there are two different things. One is the APSHA board has asked us, and I had thought I had relayed to council during our comments or at some point, that they'd like us to see if we could hold 3 units to be available for the right sizing efforts, that we could tell people that if you're right sizing and getting rid of some empty bedrooms, we would have a chance for you to move into this new project. We haven't had a further council discussion about that, but the offerings to try to incentivize people to right size are really pretty limited right now, and that is something that I think we wanted our council to discuss before we say that all 79 would not be available for that. But again, the ask was, what about 3 units, to help us with that. Then the second item I've brought up before as well publicly at the APSHA board and to this board, I really cannot see opening the lottery for these 79 units to all of Pickens County's employees within Pickens County. I realize that's past APSHA policy, but at this point in time, the city is the only one actively funding the shortfall of affordable housing and not just using mitigation dollars. These are going to be the least expensive housing units of any sort that are going to come online in the Roaring Fork Valley for, quite a while, probably 5-10 years, until there's some for sale units out at at the lumber yard. And I just can't turn back to my constituents here in the city and say, oh, these are going to be for employees of basalt businesses that have their business on the Pickens County side of basalt, when the county has not been advancing any efforts to support affordable housing beyond what they receive from mitigation dollars. And when I was on the county, I tried to push that they go forward and start to get in the affordable housing production game in a serious manner. And they're not. And the county's mitigation dollars come from new growth. And so there's always new demand for services that is left unfulfilled with each new large residential home that is built, and some mitigation dollars are given. But based on county code, the county could use 100% of their mitigation dollars just for housing county, as a business, Pickens County employees. And I had to push for a policy that said, well, half of the units have to go to general lottery, have to go to APSHA, and the other half can go for county employees. But they're not in the production game, and they're not helping us catch up on shortfall. And I've asked that we at least have some sort of priority system similar to Snowmass Village, who you can't apply to a Snowmass Village lottery when a unit first comes online and get in if you're an Aspen employee. You have to wait until nobody has bought it after 6 months, and then maybe they'll open it up to other people. But this is like unilateral disarmament, that we are continuing to be the ones to try to carry the entire burden for the affordable housing shortfall and the labor market as it exists today. And I just can't continue to do that. These are taxes paid by Aspen homeowners or Aspen businesses when they sell and buy through the real estate transfer tax. And there's a point at which I've asked, can we at least see Snowmass Village's policy to understand why Aspen employees can't get in equally to the way that Snowmass Village employees could apply for Burlingame, live in Burlingame, and be commuting up to Snowmass every day. And when I look at the subsidy per unit, per FTE for the entire project, it's just unconscionable for me to leave that door open to say, don't worry about producing housing for these other entities. Aspen will take care of it, because we can't. And no matter how hard you work, and you're working very hard, Chris, these 79 units aren't even going to make up for the more recent losses we've had in our community of traditional homes. So that's my priority. I cannot support putting these into a general lottery. As I've said before, unless Pickens County has made a choice and put something on the ballot for November 2022 to start helping with the shortfall of affordable housing. Otherwise, I have to close the barn door and say, this has got to be for workers within municipal boundaries of the city of Aspen. Thank you.
Comments?
Yeah, I have 3 comments. The in-complex bidding, I think that we should allow for some from BG 1 and 2 into 3 if we're gaining rooms, downsizing so that we're gaining bedrooms. A certain number, I guess, APSHA has determined that perhaps 3 units could be set aside for that. I think the more rooms that we can gain by not building them, more bedrooms, the better. So I do support the in-complex bidding for gaining rooms only, not for going across or increasing rooms, but just for gaining rooms, downsizing. Question on the phasing, that the completion dates, this is getting a little bit ahead, but the completion dates have been pushed back, and now we're looking at moving in, and you suggested, Chris, phasing of are we talking about phasing of lotteries, or what move-in dates are gonna be phased? And my question on that is, are we gonna have phased lotteries? And also the question about how does phasing affect staff's ability to handle phasing? And then the third one is the priority for Aspen and for people living in Aspen for moving into BG3. I think that since we're funding it, that I think we have a right to prioritize people that are employed in Aspen.
Thanks, Ward. I got to clarify that on the last item that you spoke about, you said living in Aspen, and then you said working in Aspen,
Employed in Aspen.
employed in Aspen.
Yeah, and similarly, you're talking specifically about where they're employed, right?
Yes.
Okay. So, just real quick before we move on, obviously there's regional difficulty there. Would you mean to exclude, or would you rather prioritize? And I think you said a little bit of both. Prioritize City of Aspen, workers whose job is in the City of Aspen, and then maybe workers whose job is in the ABC, and then maybe Snowmass, and then maybe further down Valley? Like some system like that?
I was taking it just for City of Aspen workforce, but I can see certainly saying something like within the urban growth boundary as determined by the AACP for housing purposes, which I think includes the Airport Business Center.
And then
But,
excluding the rest?
Yeah, you know, yeah, excluding. You know, it's just, I've asked, can we see Snowmass Village's policy? Maybe we just mirror that. And I would acknowledge that there's unsold units and that there's not that much demand for these units from Aspen employees within the City of Aspen limits, not Aspen government employees. Then we could open it back up. But, you know, we have unmet needs here, and we're the only one trying to fulfill those needs. And if a third of these units are sold to employers who could be working anywhere throughout the county and not in the city limits, and there's no sales tax for affordable housing there, there's no additional efforts to come up with something to begin to partner with us. We've underfunded the APSHA office and for years because we have this 50-50 agreement that the city will pay 50%, but the county has to take it out of their general fund. So we've constantly lowered the number of personnel and the equipment and the investment that's been needed in housing because of that. And this is the only place I have found to put a foot down. Thank you.
So in terms of the APSHA lottery process and an APSHA deed restriction, changing those employment requirements could cause us to need to modify a deed restriction potentially.
Yeah, but that's an easy thing to do. I mean, we draft the deed restriction that we want to put on it. So the minor modification that's being suggested here as to who the initial buyers are and who subsequent buyers are. I don't see an issue with that. Is that answering your question?
I'm just curious if there's some connection to APSHA and whether or not that would need to be approved by the APSHA board, since we're going to utilize APSHA as our transaction broker for the process.
We'll be able to work that out with staff.
Yeah.
That's not, I don't believe we're at a point that needs to be a policy conversation here.
Okay. I just want to talk to any potential connections that we need to recognize. In case we have a third council member who's interested in doing this, and it sounds like you are.
I am. I don't want to say that somebody that is not employed in Aspen isn't qualified to purchase, but if somebody is, I would like to see a priority assigned to a working resident or somebody that is working in Aspen. And that, I think, obviously, just like income categories, somebody earning more money after they buy a unit, that if they change their job, that wouldn't make them have to sell their unit.
I agree with that.
Okay. Just as we move forward, Mr. Mayor, if there's support for staff looking into that, you know, we'll have to take that away and go do some work on that.
Yeah, I would like clarity because this is something we'll need to work into our program. And right now I hear two of you want us to look at the prioritization of that. Are we just at 2?
No, we're not just at 2. I don't have,
Okay.
I have a feeling
Thank
we're not at just 2. But I'm going to come back to you and ask you for some input on process. Skippy and then John.
Sure. So a couple of things going on here. I want to just button up. First, on categories, I'm happy to accept that small alteration. You know, I think staff's recommendation was good. I think Rachel's logic makes sense. And just for kind of the community in that, you know, we've been talking a lot about the need for lower category units, and so it's easy to kind of look at this in a snapshot and say like, whoa, wait, why aren't we shifting all of these down? And I think, you know, we've got to step back and look at the whole picture. We have a need in many, many different areas. This project was preconceived kind of with the family in mind. That is a need that we have, and so I think moving forward with that is appropriate, knowing that on a really big project coming forward at the lumberyard, we are talking about significantly skewing to the lower categories, and knowing that in all the sort of land use code work we're doing during the moratorium, we're going to be creating tools for development, you know, outside of the city's hammer and dollar for those higher categories. So I think, you know, taking a step back, we can recognize where that fits in, and that's appropriate. I wanted to circle back on the right sizing, which I support, carving out units for that. Rachel, I don't remember the 3 number. It may be 3. Ultimately, it is up to the APCHA board. But I would like to see that board kind of set a number, and maybe we can give them a little flexibility around that. But I do want to see us prioritize that first. And just to clarify what we've talked about at the APCHA board, and what I agree with is that you'd have to actually qualify for that unit.
Absolutely.
So if you are, you know, currently in a category 1, but your income has gone up to category 5, you can't stay category 1, right? So the idea is just to test, is a new unit enough for you to add net bedroom gain and move? And I think that's appropriate. So I support that, but I would just ask we leave that number flexible for the APCHA board, who's ultimately going to decide that.
So can I ask a question? Sorry. Just in terms of how that mechanism might work, are you talking about just holding aside a number of units and saying, these are going to be the lotteries and the units that are specifically for downsizing people? Or are we going to say that something like, in a slightly different way, but a sort of a similar outcome, you know, if you are bidding on a unit and it just so happens that you're downsizing, you get a priority on this lottery. And it's not like we're holding aside a unit. We're going to go ahead and conduct a lottery like normal. We're just going to prioritize your bid above all the others in the event that you're a downsizing person. Is that?
It raises some questions for me, which was kind of around my next area. It's interlaced. I was going to ask, is one day on Home Trek 79 lotteries appear, or are they staged or that? Because from the perspective of wanting to test the merit of the program, the second thing you said sort of makes sense, right? Because then we're not only testing for these 3 units, do people want to downsize, but really, do they want to downsize and for what? But if we only want to do 3 units or 1 unit or 10 units, well, then that gets complicated if they're all happening at the same time. So I think that's the question that's back to you about the pacing of the lotteries.
Yes.
So
Can I add in on that one too?
probably more like building by building, and probably
Yeah.
a building's worth of lotteries for over the course of each week.
Yeah.
So it'll be staggered, but there will be groups.
I believe the APCHA board is really aware of the potential downsides in a change in policy that tries to create priority for those who are downsizing. We've talked about, is it just when the random units come up for resale as they do now? And what about all the people who've just been itching to buy one of those great units that's now coming up for resale, and it's not even going to a lottery because it's being used to right size? Do you do that every lottery? Do you do it every 3rd lottery? Do you do it every 5th lottery? How do you create a fairness, but at the same time try to create the movement in the system that is freeing up bedrooms and maybe allowing a family who is stuffed into a two-bedroom to get up to a three-bedroom, and a family who could live in a two-bedroom comfortably, a way to get down there. We have thought about, should there be financial incentives? But we go back to the same problem, that if the city and the county are putting in the pot 50-50, is there really any money there to do that, to help pay for the closing costs or the moving costs or any of these costs that we're asking people to incur to give up that extra bedroom that they may not be using now. And so the number 3 was just kind of thrown out as like a small, well, maybe 3 of the new ones, and we could work with that to see it. But I don't think this is a determination of the APSHA board to say we want 20 units for right sizing or something like that. That's up to this board. And it's just, that, you know, they haven't worked all the mechanics out because we don't have units. APSHA doesn't have units that it just does things with. It can turn back to the city and ask, can you assist us with developing that type of program and give us some of the assets that we need to make it work? Or we can start talking about right sizing with every random lottery that comes up. But it's somewhat likely that people who want to right size are only going to want the newest and the best units. You know, maybe things like covered parking, or maybe being able to have pets, or maybe being on the ground floor would be attractive to some people to move. Otherwise, you know, if it comes up and it's units that we know have existing HOA issues or older and outmoded and this and that, you know, we're not so sure people are going to want to move for those purposes and let go of their extra bedroom. So it's quite the dilemma. We could get into a much larger conversation about it, but it was just thought that, you know, this is coming up. If everyone's interested in trying to find the tools and the incentives for right sizing, some of the Burlingame units being available for that might be the only real ticket we have.
Got it. I appreciate that, because I thought APSHA board would decide the number, not us. So good conversation. And I want to hear from Ward, because he was the one who initially suggested this. But you mentioned different buildings. So 79 units, how many buildings are there? Like, what would be the smallest and biggest unit count per building?
I'll jump ahead. So we've got 8 different buildings, and the number of units varies. Yeah. So, you know, we would probably start at building 8, which I'm showing here, which I believe has 12 units. Okay. And then we would move on to the next building. Again, this one has 12 units. Building 10, I believe, has 6 units, and building 11, I believe, has 6 units. We're jumping around a lot, which is fine. I kind of jumped over to this phasing plan because we had planned during the construction to deliver all 79 of the units late last year. You know, we saw COVID impacts occurring throughout last year, the year before, et cetera. The modular plant mostly saw those impacts late in 2021. And then this year, we have run into some supply chain problems getting some of the materials, and that's further caused us to not be able to deliver all of the units this year. So it's looking like the box shown in red, I guess that's not a box, is it? The outline in red is what we'll be able to deliver this year, this fall, 36 units. And then the outline in the cyan we'll be able to deliver early in 2023, that's 43 units. So this plan is not 100% finalized. We are working on making this plan happen. Staggering the delivery of this, of phase 3 by these 2 sub-phases is almost exactly what we did at Burlingame phase 2. Just so happens that it was planned in phase 2, and in this case, it's sort of a fallback position. This is kind of the reality of what we're dealing with right now in terms of being able to deliver units to the community this year. So we'll be talking about 36 units this year rather than the full 79, and Pam Gable is breathing a sigh of relief to some degree. But obviously we want to deliver all 79 units as soon as we possibly can.
Got it. Okay, so what I would say, and then I kind of want to hear your guys' take, and Rachel alluded to the pros and cons of this, but you know, in determining how many units to test, if you went on the big side, right, you said like all the units are available to this, the benefits to that are that the real-world test in the field of what is going to encourage people to right size and to what type of units, we just get more and better data to inform things going forward. And the second benefit is because presumably more people have done that, we get more net bedroom gain, right? So even though people are moving into these units, now outside of these units, there's more bedrooms that are freed up. The downside to that that's been pointed out by the APSHA board is necessarily these are smaller units, right? People are going to move from a 2 to a 1 or a 3 to a 2. Those are some of our biggest need categories. And so people that are already in the sort of highest or most challenging lotteries now have even more competition for that, and who knows when their next product coming available will be. So that's sort of the balance to look at, and I'd love to get your guys' thoughts.
Well, I think that we don't really know if there's anybody that's going to even want to do this, because if you change, if you're changing to a different category and you're changing the number of bedrooms, you're going from an older to a newer unit, what the costs are, what the numbers are, how long somebody's been in a unit, what's left on their mortgage. We may not get any takers, but we've been talking about right sizing for quite a few years. And I think we've talked about, perhaps informally, but incentivizing people to move down to a smaller unit. APSHA has a voluntary program they're just initiating with no incentives. So this is a way to put our toe in the water and see if there is if it's a possibility that we can gain some bedrooms by starting this. And I would say just give it a try, see what happens. If somebody moves out of they qualified at a category 3 and now they are qualifying for category 4, does that unit they're moving out of remain a category 3?
Yes.
So those are questions that I think have to be hammered out. And I know, Chris, we're adding a couple layers of complexity to this, but you're the man.
I guess the question is, does give it a whirl mean for every unit, for one building? Like, what do you think the appropriate number of availability is?
Well, I think Chris indicated they would phase in by buildings.
Yeah.
So let's see what happens with the first couple of buildings, if there's any demand for it, and have some kind of a priority for somebody that is going from a larger number of bedrooms to smaller bedrooms, because that frees up, and admittedly, a phase 1 or 2 unit, which is an older unit, but we still would potentially gain 1 or 2 bedrooms.
I think it's well worth doing, whether it's the first, I mean, you're saying there's 3 buildings coming online. I would certainly consider that. I wouldn't have any objection to that. You know, there's going to be issues with the people leaving their units and what condition they're leaving them in, because current APSHA deed restricted homeowners don't necessarily have a deed that says they have to bring it all the way up to X standard, which is the new livability standard. So there's a lot of issues about what's get left behind and how to make this happen. And we're initiating the program at APSHA by doing a survey to ask people who've been identified with extra bedrooms or different circumstances in their lives, what would be the incentives that might make them move and free up a bedroom and right size. So that's not that we actually have a program, we're just surveying to see what incentives are really out there that people most desire. It's going to be the newer, more modern, efficient units that are easy to maintain in the future, don't have high HOA dues. You know, are you moving into something that's less expensive or more expensive? That would be the first question I would ask before I'd right size. Thank you.
Thanks.
I think we have enough feedback here. We'll come back with some suggestions. What I'm hearing is start small from a majority of you. We'll look at this, seeing how we can support APSHA, if APSHA can be ready for fall of 2022, and where their flexibility may or may not be in getting a downsizing owner to relocate. And I mean, it's just, this is a test, and I suggest starting small rather than putting all 79 in there. There's naturally some downsizing that happens with brand new units anyways, so some of that will occur, but identifying 3 units that will have a smaller lottery pool, most likely, I think is a great way to see what happens and get some lessons learned to inform any changes that might want to be made for spring of '23.
Yeah, I agree, Sarah, and I'd look to see if my council agrees. I think a small test is fine. I just want it to be large enough that we really understand the market need. You know, if it's as small as 1 unit, then we're only testing if people would downsize to that unit. So I just want to have it large enough that we kind of can come away saying like, yeah, there is interest in this area, there isn't in this area, or there isn't overall.
We'll take a look and come back with what we think, whether 3 is the magic number, if it should be something different.
Sure.
Is there a cap? Is there a maximum you don't want us to go over?
I'd like to see what you guys think.
Yeah, I would say, for me, no more than 3/4. I mean, a lot of people have been waiting for these
That's
new
fine.
units who've lost lotteries and never had a home, so I don't want to make it all available that way.
I think that's appropriate. Yeah.
Did I hear you say 3 or 4? 3?
You said 3/4?
I never want to see more than 3/4.
Oh, 3/4 of them in a downsizing program.
Yeah, no,
Okay.
not available to the general public.
Thank you. Yeah, I just want to make sure I fully understand. I appreciate it.
Okay, I've got it.
No, I'm not following, sorry.
I've got,
quarter
I've
of
got it,
units.
Chris. No more than 25% of the units can go into any type of downsizing program. We may suggest less than 25, but that
Sure.
is their ceiling.
So of the first 36 units, that would be 9 units. Okay.
Yeah, she just asked if there was a minimum. I mean, I'm
Yeah,
not
yeah.
saying that's the magic number. I'm just saying, yeah, I wouldn't want it
Clarify.
any more than that. Maybe 80%.
Sure.
Yeah, one second. And then Skippy, can you?
Yeah, I want to come back to the other piece too. So now this is on making them only available to City of Aspen individuals. And Rachel, this is one where you might just have a lot more experience than me, so hear me out and then fill me in if not. I understand the intention behind your suggestion. I understand that for a long time it has felt like our partners are not carrying their weight and our need is growing. And so we need to do something about it, and we won't have the opportunity to go back after these units are delivered. I'm also hearing from you that this could be a tool, encouragement, leverage point, use your thing, to get them to step up to the plate on the funding side going forward. I support all of those outcomes, but I guess in my experience, I don't have enough background to know if we've tried all the other ways and this is what's left. If we have, then I understand that you got to kind of play your last card. I don't know that to be true. It doesn't mean that it's not. My concern is that the approach will further segment and cause undesired rivalry between elements of our community at a time when we are finally stepping up to the plate and trying to act regionally. And I'm concerned that we're going to say, hey, we want to act regionally, collaboratively, and work together. We're doing this over here, but in our actions, we're starting to do the opposite. And then do we encourage other communities to start to do that as well? So I'm wondering if there's other means to get to the same end that are less, at least in my read, divisive.
You know, Skippy, Basalt has just made new approvals of development in Basalt and said that the affordable housing units that are being provided by the developer must go to employees of Basalt. And they put money in for the potential of a regional nonprofit to help pull down funds. We've seen others that aren't. And even as we stepped into that, we all said, I believe, that there's a lot of differences between us regionally. And I don't see Aspen joining a regional housing authority, putting in our revenues in communities that barely have a 10% affordable housing mitigation standard for all their new growth. You know, so there's a lot of reasons why people were skeptical about a regional housing authority until such point at which you see at some level comparable contributions and set-asides and land banking and zoning regulations and decreasing of demand through STR management that Aspen is taking on. And, you know, when the Board of County Commissioners came out of their retreat of what are their priorities for this year, and housing did not make it, and just we'll study the housing issue to potentially have a ballot question in 2024 when there's a big presidential race again. And that means no new dollars in the future for the projects. And all the grants are going, and I certainly voted to support saving Phillips Curve from losing that affordable housing. But you know, the magnitude of millions that it's going to take there to rebuild the sewer plant and replace, that's going to be all their mitigation dollars for quite a while to come, in my estimation. And, you know, there are opportunities. There's land banking opportunities now that are passing us by, that are going to pass the community by. And it's just, we can't carry the 50-pound knapsack all the way up the hill. There are employee shortages that are affecting businesses, that are closing businesses. When you see the Glenwood Springs Town Council raise all their salaries by 5%, and every private business is going to follow that, and on and on and on, we're not going to be able to service the people who come to our town anymore. We hear it daily, and I just, as a moral responsibility, have felt this uneven system, both with Snowmass Village's housing and our own. And I just can't put this many more units onto the sale and say, these are for employees in Redstone, since you can't hire any from Glenwood Springs anymore. These are for employees down in Basalt, because Pickens County has businesses in Basalt that would qualify. Or Snowmass Village, that we're putting this out there. And what might be the result? 25% of the workers end up working in the city limits of Aspen. Maybe we get lucky and it's 50%, and we subsidize with tens of millions of dollars the workforce for other communities who are not contributing. I just can't do it anymore. It's that simple. I think this is the right tool.
Can I interject just a couple of clarifications just to check and see yay or nay in terms of what we're talking about here? If you did limit applicants to workers whose jobs were specifically within the UGB, you would still get applicants who don't already live in APSHA housing.
That's correct.
They work within the UGB, but
That's
they
right.
don't live in Aspen. They could live in Basalt or beyond.
Right.
So you're not excluding folks coming, you know, relocating up the valley, right? But you're prioritizing people who, but it probably would cause a disproportionate number of the sales to be to people with jobs who already do live in probably would be a side effect, right? And then you would end up having to resell the units that they move out of,
Yep.
or re-rent the units that they move out of. So that would probably cause, you know, some additional administration on the back end to fill those units. But then those units could take applicants from Snowmass and from
Correct.
The Pickens County portion of Basalt equally, right? So,
Yes.
so you're only really excluding people from those specific spots, essentially Snowmass and part of Basalt, to the new units.
You know, actually, it's every employer in Pickens County that is not within the city limits. So it's more than just Snowmass, it's more than Basalt. It's, as I said, these are the last and the most affordable units that are going to be coming online for any sort of ownership opportunity that I'm aware of in our valley.
I was just trying
Period.
to clarify the effect.
Yeah, no,
that
it
would
will have a lot of effect. And with any help loc at all, we'll see more people taking the issue and the problem and the loss of workforce seriously, where it's not now.
I just want to make sure that people out there in the world understand, you're not saying that people won't be able to relocate up the valley.
Oh, not at all.
Yeah.
Not at all. You know, it's always been the same if you've lived or worked. But, you know, one last thing to think about. I don't know why, I mean, we had a work session not long ago, and this came up as some of the topics. And I asked the same thing, and there were 3 head nods at that time or more to say, yeah, let's at least look at this. Let's see what's going on. And I had anticipated that we would probably have a copy of Snowmass Village's prioritization system or some other things baked into this now, because we did get head nods to say, hey, let's at least understand the pros and cons and the ins and outs. And I'm not asking for a hard and fast decision on that now from our board, but it was brought up before. There was interest by the board before, and I think we should go forward and at least examine what are the ups and the downs of this and the potentials, because you're right, it could be divisive and it could be alienating. But at the same time, do we continue as one entity to try to house the workforce needs of
Yeah.
everyone in the valley?
Yeah.
And that's what's happening now
I get it.
in Pickens County, and I just can't support that.
No, I get that, Rachel. I appreciate it. And I do want to know more. I mean, if we're being asked to vote on this today, I'm not there, but I do want to know more. It might be the right strategy. I totally hear that. So I guess the question is, how do we move that
We'll get there in a
forward?
second.
And how do because I have specific things I'd want answered from staff that would help me get there.
We'll get there in a second. I want John's input on this first, and then I'm going to come back to Sarah about how we do get this information out and back to us. John, your thoughts on a couple of points: right-sizing opportunity, the conversation that just happened here, and then the latest suggestion that's on the table.
Well, I think both Rachel and Skippy brought up excellent points. We shouldn't bear the full burden. We don't want to become adversarial. So we have to weigh that. As far as units available for the experiment, we'll call it, I was thinking anywhere from 3 units to one of the 6-unit buildings, but no more. And then the other thing is, I do agree with Rachel. I'd like to see the employees be living or working in the UBG to qualify for the new units. I mean, especially since there's a backdoor for everybody else in existing units.
Okay. All right. So there is support on both items, the right sizing and some limited opportunity within complex. I believe what we're talking about is just Burlingame's 1 and 2, being able to try this out, and we're hoping to get some information about how that could be put in place, with a limit on how many of those units would be available to that, and then also the idea of priorities for Aspen employees, and getting more information returned to us on those. Sarah, what is your process suggestion here?
I think Chris and I need probably, I'm going to guess, 3 weeks to probably pull this together with a response back to you with some options. It might not be fully fleshed out, but enough for you to start telling us, are we on the right path? Before we devote a ton of time of something being completely fleshed out. I think what I'm trying to reconcile right now is in-complex bidding with the APSHA set aside and how that would work or
Yeah.
not work, because that's a little tricky to me, but I'm not saying no, we just need to think that through.
Right, because, the intent of bringing this up today, the in-complex bidding, as I'm showing it here on the slide, was related not to the downsizing question, was related only to in-complex bidding. We get the question, people say, can we in-complex bid in a phased project? And, it's written into the regulations that the answer is no. But in some way, it could be incorporated into your downsizing test to say that potentially, people could in-complex bid if and only if they're downsizing. And so that's one angle that could be used to help your test case.
I think we just need to the first week of May to work through this and we need to bring a couple of the APSHA staff into the conversation to talk through some mechanics of it, not just the policy and process side, and bring you back a little more information. The other thing is, none of this seems over the top to me as being able to be performed within our existing resources. The one thing I'm hearing that I need clarification on is I hear some of you talk about it, employment within the urban growth boundary, and some of you saying within the city limits. I don't need an answer today, but I will need an answer when I come back to you very soon about which one is it, because people are going to clamor for this information, and I would rather give them clarity as quickly as possible as they're making their life choices.
For me personally, I'd love to see it the city of Aspen limits, because it is the airport business center, doing business, making sales, not collecting any sales tax for childcare, not collecting any sales tax for housing. It's a free ride for those businesses to be able to stay in City of Aspen built and subsidized housing, and not turn to their county commissioners and say, why aren't you guys doing anything about the housing problems we are all facing? And I think that we've got to start shifting this away from City of Aspen only to the broader regional group that we should be. That's where I would start, but I could modify that from there, but the UGB would be the very least. I think I had said that when Chris was talking about tiering, if you didn't have enough City of Aspen and Aspen municipal boundary employees in the first set of lotteries, then you could go to a larger net.
And is that difference able to be shared with us in that 3 weeks? Is that what you're saying? Or do you?
I think we can do a cascading fall of eligibility in terms of policy document. It might take us a little longer to figure out how to actually implement it. But yeah, we just heard, so John, if I could clarify your position, because I saw you shaking your head in agreement with Rachel, but a little bit ago you said the urban growth boundary. So that's why I was actually asking this clarification question, because I didn't know where you fell.
Yeah, I'm leaning towards Rachel's position. Just keep it inside the city.
Thank you.
Or, I don't know, there was also talk about tiering it so that Basalt and was it the ABC were on a different level?
We'll take a look at it, and you can move the different neighborhoods up and down as the council sees fit, but we'll identify what might be those groups.
All right, thanks.
Skippy?
I just had a question for clarification, because when you were doing the summation, it confused me. Were you saying that the right sizing would only be allowed for category, or for Burlingame 1 and 2 individuals? You're not saying that, right?
I was saying that we were considering it as in complex or in Burlingame.
As opposed to from anywhere?
Correct.
Okay, I would strongly disagree with that.
That's fine.
Okay, I don't know if we've made up our mind. We didn't really talk about that. I didn't understand. I thought we were saying we're not doing young complex and then we're doing this, but the whole point of this is to figure out our
Okay,
people.
it's all good. So Sarah, as we're getting information back on this part of it, we're talking about that difference as well.
Yeah, and we'll bring you back a few more detailed policy questions about in complex for, right? You will be requesting APSHA change their guidelines for delivery of these units if you wish to allow any type of in-complex bidding. Just to be completely clear, you actually have some limits on your control of that. So we will say, we need to get some feedback from the staff at APSHA and say, what do you think? Do you have any sense of how your board might react to that? And how do we address what might be their concerns if that were to be removed to allow relocation within Burlingame neighborhood as well?
And just to clarify, for me, the employment would be within the city limits of Aspen. I feel that it's an equity question that the funds are coming from City of Aspen, so I'd like to see the priority for City of Aspen employees.
And they're saying that they will come back with that as one option, but that they are willing to also expand that to look at the UGB as being that boundary. If you're saying it as of right now, your opinion is that you don't need to see that comparative study and that you just want to do it in city limits of Aspen?
Yeah, that's my position.
Okay, so he's just city of limits.
Yeah, Tori, I think what was discussed is that to start with the City of Aspen, and if you've not sold all the units through the priority system there, then there might be a secondary tier or a third tier who could have qualified. And that's the type of thing that's got to be brought back. But the first go-round would be City of Aspen. Municipal boundaries, in my opinion.
It could be.
It could be. And
Or-
they're going to come back with some.
Or it could come back and everybody go, hey, you know what, let's actually include them.
That's right.
It would not go.
That's right, I
It would go
understand.
against the grain of what you're originally, right, but
Let's
anyway,
start.
I think that's, I understand, yeah.
Okay.
Sorry, I just don't want to leave being confused. I wasn't talking about that piece of like who gets them. I was talking about the right sizing piece of, I think we're now saying 3 to 1 building is sort of the zone. I was talking about those units and who can have that priority and where they come from.
We're gonna find out if that is community-wide, housing program-wide.
Okay.
Or if that is Burlingame specific.
So options will come back.
Yes.
Okay.
And before we even answered if it's Burlingame, Sarah's request is to be able to have that conversation with APSHA and get some more information from them about their feelings. Because doing it outside Burlingame is not going against any regulations that are in place.
Right.
While doing it in Burlingame does cross that line of
and
being
I'm
complex.
Totally open to including them. My concern
Right,
is
you wanna do it
excluding
larger.
the rest so we can appropriately test. Okay, and then in the question you guys are, so I can consider it, how do I put forth what I would like to hear more of?
On the second side?
Yeah, on the
second question?
excluding other parts of the traditional applicant pool outside the UGB or outside City of Aspen.
That's other information that's gonna come back to us. Did you wanna share something now?
Yeah, I think what's important for me to understand is sort of the history, like we have a desired outcome from these groups, but, you know, have other approaches been tried and failed, or have they not been tried? And then I want some kind of read on what effect we think this will have on relationships with other jurisdictions or counties.
I'll answer the second question right now.
Okay.
Quite frankly, the other communities have already had this policy position, and we've had the most lenient one of them all.
Yeah.
So you don't think they'll
And
care?
so this is, you know,
Catching
so it's not a new condition being created, first of all. Secondly, you know, we have to recall that even though, for example, Snowmass Village has a sales program, you're required to work in Snowmass Village at the time of purchase, just like here. They have folks who now don't work in Snowmass, who live in those units and hold deed restricted and come and work in our community. So there's some reciprocity that already exists in some of those situations. Back in February, when council brought this up, I did forward you the policy for Snowmass Village, as well as information to share with you that they had not done a recent census of employment for their ownership units. To have an idea of what that mix is today. I will tell you, though, this has been sort of a crux for them in the program as well, sort of saying, why are we housing workers who don't work in our community? So it's not, and it's not a place of animosity, it's just, I think, frustration of the supply and demand issue overall. On your first question about what has been tried in the past, you know, at one point, and actually still on the books, is a second housing authority. I really don't think it's in the community's interest for that to be risen from the grave, if you will. It's there on paper, but it is the unincorporated portions of the county that it covers. And I don't know that we really would have a lot of historical information about we could access. I'm just thinking about record keeping that long ago. I doubt that we have great records to be able to tell you what was accomplished under that authority versus what APSHA just took over. Do you have any ideas, Rachel?
Nope.
Yeah, and if she doesn't know, then chances of me finding anything are pretty small.
No, I mean, if you meant in terms of trying to get the county to do a funding question, you know, I think, most people just turn to the city. The city's the bad guy for anything. And when you sit there and ask people what do they think about the management of the landfill, they'll tell you, well, the city does a terrible job. You know, I mean, I've done these, the who provides what services is just, you know, not really clear in a lot of people's minds. But you know, the resistance has just been there, you know, to saying that we need to be producing housing on a big scale, a relative scale at all, or that there's a problem, and there is a problem. It's getting worse. It's a crisis. It's no longer a problem.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Thank you.
I think that maybe you've agreed to number one with some modification.
Yeah.
Is that fair to say?
Yes.
And I think you agree to number two with some modification as well, and we need to come back to you with some variations on downsizing, some number of units, some way to test the waters for demand for downsizing. And we need to come back to you with a proposal that potentially limits the applicants based on where their job is located. I just want to be clear for the rest of the world who's watching. That policy would not, or that policy for this project would not limit the ability of people who work in Aspen to relocate up the valley. You would still be maintaining the ability to relocate workers closer to where they work, which is a keystone of the project, of the program, right? And then the only other thing that I want to add, and this is maybe just for me, an eventual downsizing policy. I understand that we're using this development as a tool to gain information, but an eventual downsizing policy, in my opinion, would be best if it's development neutral in some way and doesn't rely on developments. But in this case, using the development as a test case to try to prove something related to downsizing, fine with me.
Yeah.
Great.
Thanks.
Cool.
And we're trying to call it right-sizing, not downsizing, for everybody, not just you.
And Chris, I just want to confirm my commitment that we'd be back the first week of May didn't put you over the edge. Is that something with the lumberyard timeline?
No, my only question is whether or not the APSHA survey could inform the work and whether or not we would want to wait for the APSHA survey results, but
Yeah, let's talk about that with the APSHA staff. We can at least provide an interim update.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, Chris. Before you go, just 2 seconds, how is the project going? Not on timeline stuff, the quality that you're seeing, the installation, the assemblage, how's it going?
the quality of the units is excellent. I think what you'll see is an improvement over the quality that we had in Burlingame Phase 2. The factory built really did do its job in that term. But at the same time, we did recognize that when you're doing a factory-built project, you're relying on the factory in terms of your timeline. So we're experiencing that as well. So pros and cons there. We do still see the amount of site work that's required is extensive. And getting all the site work done, and with the intermittent weather conditions we've had, it's always a bit of an adventure. So the quality's coming along. As you know, the timeline, we're doing our best to stagger the delivery. The project's still on budget, despite the fact that we have seen some construction cost increases and we've seen some change orders, nothing that hasn't been expected. Some of our contracts, particularly the modular contract, we did have protections against escalations. So we do have some insulation from some of the escalations that have been thrown at us. And then in other cases, we've had to absorb some with our contingency as well. So project is still on budget. The contingency has been consistently being used to sort of take up the slack on some of those things that we're seeing. But for the most part, roughly as planned in terms of budgetary.
Thanks so much for that.
Does the council wish us to arrange another site visit opportunity sometime here this spring?
Yeah, I'd like to go.
Okay, we're getting close enough. We'll talk with Shaw and see when they think the site might be safe for that.
Great. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Is that everything, Chris?
Thanks, Chris.
Everything I had.
Great. We have another agenda item coming up on short-term rentals. We'll take just 3 to 5 minutes to switch over or take a quick break for those that are in the room with us, and we'll be right back. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you.
Well done.
Likewise.
What place was gray?
All right. We are back on, and we are on to item 2 for our agenda this evening, and this is the short-term rental policy work that we're doing.
Welcome. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. If you don't mind, I'm going to share my screen here.
Please do.
Okay, I think we're all set. For the record, Philip Sapino, Community Development Director for the City of Aspen. I am joined by Haley Hart, who is a planner with the City of Aspen. I'd like to introduce her to council. This is her first time visiting with you all. Haley joins us from Georgia. She's been with community development for 9 months now, and she was just promoted from zoning officer to planner. Well, she'll be focusing on long-range policy issues working under Ben Anderson. Awesome. We're really, really excited about her and the work that she's done. Board is clearly very excited about the work that she's done. Yeah, she's been an absolute rock star since the day she got here, and she's Tyler Kristoff's cousin. So we're keeping it in the family around here.
That got the big response. We're like, oh, great.
Oh, okay, you're welcome.
You've got street cred.
And then,
That's right. That's pretty great.
Philip,
So anyway, yes, please.
Oh, and Jim would really like us to know that there's a Georgia Tech fan.
Philip, for your consideration,
Yes, sir.
in your presentation, you and I didn't coordinate about public comment this evening. We have several audience members that I think are interested in probably commenting, maybe a few online as well. I'm trying to figure out a balance between saving those comments to the end, but I'd almost rather take them at the beginning. Now, there's pluses and minuses to both those approaches, but I don't know these people's schedules and what they've got in their regular lives. So I'm interested in facilitating getting their input early on, and especially not to get that input before maybe we've done any direction for things to come back to council.
Absolutely.
So if you'll just think about that of maybe an appropriate and best time to take public comment.
I have a few introductory slides, and it might be appropriate after that, before we get into the meat of the discussion, to take public comment at that time, if that's okay with you.
Sounds good to me. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. So again, we're here to discuss some specific policy questions around the regulation of short-term rentals in the city. You've seen this graphic before. We continue to update the gray sliding scale there, moving closer and closer to the June 8th expiration of the moratorium. Staff is working hard on drafting code language, continuing to run public engagement, and doing the research necessary to provide you with the ordinances that you've requested in response to Ordinance 6. This evening, this is a follow-up to a work session we had on March 1st, where we ran through some major sort of regulatory categories. There was a long and detailed discussion where staff ran through, based upon our research and direction from consultants, the sort of general categories in which short-term rentals are regulated in other communities and according to best practice, and asked council for direction on their desire to review potential regulations for the city in each of those categories. The response was yes, broadly to everything, and so we have been doing that research, and we are preparing ourselves to come back to you with a sort of regulatory framework in a work session prior to reviewing an ordinance. And so it's important for me to note that this is a little bit challenging. We're getting into a challenging moment here insofar as it's difficult to think about specific elements of a regulatory program like this in a vacuum. And it's difficult to think about them in a linear way when they're so interrelated. And we recognize that and sort of regret the fact that we do have to have some of these conversations in somewhat might feel like being out of order. But we're doing our best to provide you with the information that you need to make informed decisions to, again, get to that moment when we're in a work session discussing in broad terms the entire regulatory framework that we as staff will ultimately recommend to council for your consideration. Our process which is a collaboration with the finance department, has been really going on for more than 2 years. If you remember, in the fall of 2019, many members of this council directed us to adopt the Muni Revs system and some initial changes to the land use code, which made it clear some issues around permitting and tax compliance that were not clear under the previous regulatory system. And following up on that 2019 direction from council, we've had work sessions around the state of the industry. We've had work sessions reviewing data gathered by the Muni Rev system since it was put in place. There was a particularly important work session in November of 2021 where council directed us to begin the process to look closely at more robust regulations for short-term rentals in the city of Aspen. And so while some of the work under the Ordinance 6 moratorium really began in earnest this winter, this conversation's been going on for years, and staff's conception of the issues and our potential responses have been evolving for that long, and our work with some of the affected parties has really been ongoing for that long. So the short-term rental conversation's been on a little bit of a longer timeline. With respect to the work done since March 1st, we have been running a technical advisory committee made up of about a dozen local industry professionals and residents. Many of those folks are in the room and on the call today. I want to thank them all personally at this time for the time and energy and support that they've put into this process. We are asking them to engage in some technically heavy and fairly contentious discussions, and they are doing so in a constructive and supportive way, and we staff are grateful for that. We have been doing the case studies project. The report, the sort of end result is in your packet this evening. We've been working closely with our consultants on the fee nexus study, the case studies review, and best practices consultations for the last month since we got that direction again from you in the work session on March 1st. And finally, public engagement has been ongoing. The mayor's decision to take public comment tonight is again another opportunity for that public engagement on a topic that we know folks are quite interested in. And finally, Mr. Mayor, before I hand it over to you for public comment, just to run through what it is that we are asking of council tonight. We're looking for specific direction on 6 policy options. The types of permits that the city would include in its regulatory scheme, permit caps by zone and zone type and by permit type, the allocation of those permits, should caps be put in place, how we would give permits to people under a cap system, whether or not council desires any zone districts to be exempted from a cap system, if there is a cap system. The residential multifamily zone district, what is it and what should we do with it? And finally, a question about the timing of any potential consideration of a tax ballot question and whether that should happen this year. Mr. Mayor, those are my introductory remarks, and as I suggested, I think now might be an appropriate time in recognition of people's schedules to take public comment.
Thanks for that, Philip. First of all, are there any council comments or questions at this time?
Just one question. Well, we can get in more detail, but just so I understand before we jump in. On number 6, the STR tax, is it the expectation that fees will cover sort of the operation of the oversight and that a tax would be something else that could, say, fund housing and that those are separate, or would the tax also be trying to gather the revenue for sort of the operations and oversight of the system?
A regulatory fee for which there is a rational nexus in a nexus study is typically focused, yes, on program administration and direct organizational costs to the management of the program.
Okay.
A tax could be structured any number of ways, and I'll leave it to the attorneys in the finance department to walk council through that.
Thank you.
Thanks, Philip. John?
I just had a quick question. I just wanted to say thank you for such a well-written packet on this subject tonight. I thought it answered all my questions, and I really think that it's great for the public to be able to read that and understand what it is we're talking about. I do have a question. My question is, who writes those briefs? I would have guessed the department head, but I realized I don't know the answer to that.
So it's typically on top of the memo. This particular memo was written by Haley and I.
That's kind of what I thought.
And since it came up, I have to note that we did so, both of us, with the stomach flu. So the fact that it was comprehensible is excellent, because I was a little concerned as we were going. I was legitimately nervous.
Asking for a friend. Thanks.
Thanks, John.
It's fine.
Okay, I am going to open it up for public comment. I understand that we're having you comment a little bit before the presentation. There is a 7-page memo that's been available to the public, and if you want that, we can get that sent to you if you don't have it. I am going to ask that we limit comments to about 3 minutes, just so that everybody has a fair and equal opportunity to speak. For those that are in room, we're going to use this chair at the end, and the microphone is already on for you. We'll start with in-room, and then we'll go to online. And like I said, we're going to try to move through this as efficiently as we can. So I'll start with in-room. Are there members of the public that want to comment this evening on short-term rentals? Come on up in the front row. Yes, you. Great. Please introduce yourself for the record.
My name is Rick Boyd, and I've lived in Aspen for 49 years, and I've always worked as a carpenter and a framing contractor. And I came here in 1973, and I framed on the Gantt for 2 years and earned my journeyman's ranking as a carpenter. And it was a union job, Greer Construction out of California. But anyhow, okay, so I'm 71 years old. And I've had 13 surgeries. I got knee replacements, hip replacements, 4 reconstructed shoulders, and I no longer do manual labor anymore. But in the time I've lived here, I've acquired 3 condominiums that are free market, and I own 3 out of 4 of the top floor of the Gavilon. And I have STR licenses for all 3 of them. Now, I live in one of the units, and I rent out the other 2. And I use this income to supplement my Social Security check, which isn't much. Okay, well, I was recently offered a 1-year lease on one of the units for $7,000 a month. And that would be more than I make short-terming. But I didn't accept it because I have the unit under, I'm trying to sell the unit. I have it listed, and I don't want to be locked in to a long-term lease. I need the flexibility of being able to sell this unit. And, oh man. Anyhow, so these people that I short-term my place to, they're tourists. They come to Aspen, and they spend a lot of money doing outdoor activities, shopping, going out to dinner, and they spend a lot of money and they pay a lot of sales tax, which is a great help to the city. But anyhow, one other point here is in all the condo hotels in town, these are individually owned units too, that are nightly rented. And the way I see it is I'm basically in that category too. And what determines whether or not a condominium complex can short-term rent it is the condominium declarations. And in the last 25 years, everybody who's bought into our building has bought in because we allow short-term rentals. And the way I manage my units is I check the reviews of people. And if they don't have good reviews, I don't allow them in. And I've had really good luck. It's been working out great. I don't have to deal with any long-term tenants who are hoarders, or they party hard, or they let friends' dogs come in. They smoke cigarettes right below me. It's coming up through. I have a 3-day minimum on my stays, and I have a cleaning service in there after every guest. And my places are now immaculate. They change, the cleaning service does the laundry, changes the linens. It's working out great. Anyhow, The way I see it is, I don't think it's the city's position to be regulating what this legal binding document of a condominium declaration states. Some properties don't allow short-term, like for instance, Woodfield Arms. That's set, you know, they don't allow it. Ours do, and that's why people have bought into our building. Okay,
Thank you, Rick.
Thank you.
that's it.
Thanks, Rick.
Thank you.
Members of the public in the room this evening, care to make comments at this time?
Hi, my name's Elizabeth Sargent, and I'm an Aspen mom, and I have been a vacation rental owner. It's not a disease like an STD, since 2007, since 2010 here in Aspen. And I think I kind of want to echo some of the things that were said quickly, that there's lots of us individual vacation rental owners, that this is how we feed our families. And our places are the cleanest. They're cleaned all the time. Our places are the best maintained. When you were mentioning that when someone's been living in a unit for a long time, it may not be up to standards to sell. I used to have an 8-unit building in Miami Beach, and they started shutting down vacation rentals because of the hotel lobby. And it was the best building on the block. We had the best garden. You want to keep everything beautiful. And I think one of the advantages of vacation rentals is we live and die by our reviews. And people are very picky, and people love to criticize. And we work really hard to keep them safe and clean and fabulous. And I think it's great to talk about looking at inspections for life safety things, but when you're a part of Airbnb, you agree to a whole bunch of things. So I think there's a lot that comes from the platforms that we rent on that also helps with that. And then when I came to the open house, I was told a story about this Airbnb bait and switch that's going on here. And I think there's some confusion, because the great thing about Airbnb is they don't pay the owner until the guest confirms they spent one night in the unit. And that's how you don't get screwed, and you don't screw other people. So I think there are so many nuances to it, and I think those of us who do this full time feel a little bit like there is a groundswell. I was equally interested in the employee housing discussion for the first part of this meeting, because I live in Aspen, and I think we need 3,000 beds or something insane like that. And I am endlessly supportive of that. I don't think taking away my livelihood is the way to house people. And I think my units are not suited for long-term living. They have closets that are this big in them. And that's all. And thank you so much, and I really appreciate your taking comments.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Quick question for you.
Yeah.
How many units do you rent in Aspen?
So I currently have one that I rent all the time, and then the other half of our life is in Costa Rica. We have a 7-bedroom vacation rental down there. So when we go there, we rent our unit that we live in, and then I manage a unit for neighbors that I don't own.
Thank you. Thanks,
Thank you.
Elizabeth. Good to see you. Phyllis?
Hello,
Hi, Phyllis.
Phyllis Bronson. We all see things through different lenses, and I've been here a long time, as you know, and I don't agree with the last two speakers. And what we are having is a crisis in the quality of life in Aspen. And we have APSHA, and we have Uber houses that are often empty. But what we don't have is the middle anymore. And the messy vitality that made the middle the core of Aspen for the last 42 years that I've been here has been slowly disappearing. And what's missing are free market, long-term rentals that have been largely eaten up by STRs and other factors. But it's such a paradox, because there's a lot of good stuff happening in the commercial core and a lot of vitality. I don't like every pop-up, but overall, there are good projects coming to completion in time now, and other things that are happening. The core, the commercial core, has a lot of vitality. Our neighborhoods are dying. I live on the east side near City Market now. I've lived many lives here. I've lived there, I've lived on the east side for 11 years. And there's a whole block between where I live and City Market of high-end townhomes. I have seen 2 people there, literally, in the last over 2 months. Nobody's there. High-end townhomes permeate the general neighborhoods between, well, Cooper, Durant, and there are a few that are lived in. Most of them are not with any regularity. And then the great messy vitality of the alleys is still there, and that's wonderful. But that's what we used to be about, a real mixture. And then if you go further east, it's all so many STRs. I can't even begin to tell you, because I go out and walk a lot, and I pretend to be friendly, and I talk to people and say, you know, well, where are you from? Or, where, you know, you look lost. Or and invariably it's, I'm here for 3 nights, I'm here for 4 nights. Oh, where are you staying? Oh, you know, and they kind of look down often and say, well, I'm staying at this person's, you know, whatever. It's happening so much now. And I have empathy for what these people are saying that went before, but I don't agree. And it's kind of like saying, you know, the U.S. government has to have some oversight over the states, right? And our guiding document, the Aspen Area Community Plan, has to have some power to bring us back, if possible, or bring us into the future in a healthier way. And I would be all for regulating hard the STRs in the residential zone so that I don't have to listen to 2 different couples fighting in 1 week in a different unit near where I live. And I don't want to live that way. And I would be all for having more density. Have a great apartment building that is part of the criteria for getting it built would be only full-time, long-term locals with a gradation of pricing. And by the way, and gradation of sizes. We need mid and upper rentals. That's what's gone. I want to say one more thing. There is something to being a local here. And if you're not one, you don't know what that is. But if you are one, you do know it. It's an intrinsic thing. And my friends, my peers are feeling this innate sadness that it's going. And this council, for the first time in years, we've seen some real activism. We're very proud of you. And we hope you will zone it like you mean it. And you know, saying things like, well, the 2nd and 3rd and 4th homeowners, they write big checks to already often bloated institutions that are too, it's too much anyway. Some of these programs that used to be so discerning are now it's just more and more and more. And you don't just write a check and become a local. All right, I'm done.
Thanks, Phyllis.
Thanks, Phyllis.
Thank you. In room, members of the public that are in room that want to make comments this evening on short-term rentals? All right, I'll look on WebEx then. Again, available to those that are joining us on WebEx. We're taking comments this evening in our work session on short-term rentals. If you're on WebEx, you could either raise your hand on WebEx or you could unmute yourself and introduce yourself. That's one way to raise a hand. Go ahead and introduce yourself for the record. I guess it might be Ben.
Sorry, I didn't see the button there. Hi, everybody. My name is Ben Wolf. I'm with Frias Properties of Aspen. I'm the general manager there, and I've had the pleasure of serving on the technical advisory committee. And I just want to give kudos to Philip and Haley for leading that group and all those that are part of it. I think it's been eye-opening and certainly a collaborative effort. So I just want to run down a few points and just kind of make clear where I stand on the matter and where Frias Property stands. There was some talk earlier about condotels, and the gentleman from the Gavilan kind of felt like his building was similar to a condotel. I tend to agree. If you go back well before my time, many of the condo buildings that were some of the first condos in Colorado were built in Aspen and have always served as short-term rentals. Some of them more so in the past than now, with less people spending so much time here. So I would encourage council to consider that when setting policies and think about the fact that a lot of these buildings have always had short-term rentals, and it hasn't been so negatively impactful. Also, as the gentleman mentioned from the Gavilan, HOAs have the ability to set their own parameters, their own rules. Frias manages over 45 HOAs. Many of them have different rules and governing documents. And if the HOA, which is essentially a small community, feels that they have a problem, they then have the ability with the majority or supermajority of their owners to make changes and set different rules. So I'm in no way saying that I don't support common sense regulations, but I want you all to keep in mind that some of these condo buildings are in residential zones, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they would have negative impacts on the residential community they're a part of. So and something I would encourage council to consider is to focus more on the problem areas, those areas that maybe traditionally never had short-term rentals until maybe the last 5 years, and think about some ways to regulate those areas a little more, keep the residential nature of them, but maybe not harm people like Elizabeth and others that are renting the right way in buildings that literally have always had rentals. When it comes to permitting, I think we all support the permitting. I think it's been a really good way for the city council and the community development to learn exactly what's going on. But I certainly don't think it's fair to start from scratch. And I would encourage you all to consider using an attrition method where if we are going to set certain limits in certain zones, grandfather in the existing permits and let it go down to the limit you prefer over time, so as not to harm any individuals that are currently renting. I also don't see, as much as I would love to see this, and I used to rent free market in Aspen, back in 2012, I just simply do not see free market condos that are renting, for decent numbers now. If short-term rentals are taken away, I don't see those going back into the housing pool, the affordable housing pool, that locals could actually afford to rent. Even if somebody were to rent long-term, they would get way more than a local can afford. And, I think that's just the market, and that might correct over time, but that's certainly the case right now. We would certainly support a tax, an additional tax that goes directly towards impact mitigation and specifically employee housing, to help fund and manage that program. Obviously, there's a need for more housing and housing that's very well managed. So I don't think any guests coming to Aspen would be opposed to paying a 1 or 2% or whatever you all decide tax to support that and have great people here that are happy to work, because it is getting more and more difficult to staff in the service industry. And lastly, I'll just say that obviously, as a property management company, we would certainly support higher standards and a more intricate vetting process of, the quote unquote local contact that's people put on their applications. So, there certainly should be somebody that is here available 24/7, can respond to emergencies or just provide guidance. And while many people are doing it the right way, there's certainly many that are not. So I think as part of the application process, certainly there should be, maybe it's even an interview with the property manager, with the individual that is serving as the emergency contact, to confirm that they are available, that they do live here, that they, can be at the property in short time and aren't just a phone number that may or may not pick up. So again, I thank you all for your time and consideration, and happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thanks, Ben.
Ben, thank you so much. Thanks for your time tonight, but also thank you for participating, both you, yourself, and others from Fry's. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, Tori.
Other members of the public that are on WebEx this evening, if you're interested in commenting at this time on short-term rentals, again, if you don't want to comment this evening, we have many channels and opportunities for you to share your input. So we're always open to getting your emails, and that's both staff or council members. But here's an opportunity for you to speak this evening. So if there's any other members of the public on WebEx, I call again for you. And one more call. Members of the public that are on WebEx this evening, I just hit an unmute button, so you should have the ability to unmute yourselves. Still? All right, not seeing any. I'm going to go ahead and bring it back to the presentation. All right, thank you to those that showed up this evening for comment. Philip?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'll begin sharing my presentation again.
If it's quick. If it's quick.
Yes, I'd like to say that.
Come on back up. I need you at the microphone.
Yes, I'd like to add one thing. I'm trying to sell my condo, and everyone who's looked at it has the same question. Well, can I short-term rent it to cover my expenses, the mortgages, assessments, tax, insurance, and utility, when I'm not in town using it myself? And I've told them, it doesn't look like you will be able to, as a new owner, you will be able to pull a license to do that. And so in 4 months, I haven't had any offers at all. But I'd just like to say that I think that our licenses ought to be transferable to the new owner.
Thank
you. And also, all these condo hotels. What happens if a person in one of those sells their unit?
Thanks, Rick. I appreciate it. We are considering your comments exactly. Those points have been brought up. I appreciate it.
Okay, thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thanks, Rick.
I wasn't going to respond at this time to any of the public comment. There were a few items that I would respond to. The latest one that I would say is that, Rick, this council at no time has talked about eliminating all STRs in our community. We recognize that there are historically used properties for vacation and short-term rental. We're taking that into consideration. I would probably suggest to you it was a little premature to say to any interested buyers that they will probably not be able to get a permit. You're probably way ahead of the conversation if that's what you've inferred. Yeah, I wouldn't think that that's the condition here. But thank you for bringing that last point up. Okay, Philip, I'm sorry.
Please, thank you, Mayor Tory. So jumping right into the questions, unless there are any questions from council on the process. And this portion of the presentation follows the memo exactly. But the first question that staff seeks direction on in order to sort of dig deeply into our drafting process is whether or not council favors having 3 permit types. And this question that really goes back to direction we've received from council and comments we've received from the public, many of which you heard echoed this evening, about not only differences in how different unit types operate, but differences in how short-term rental ownership translates into presence in our community or not. And that's a business presence or a individual sort of human presence, right? And the proposal from staff, described in the memo, the 3 permit types, is not only in response to the feedback from council, the feedback from the public, and frankly, an assessment of our community condition as it relates to the tourist economy and our residential properties. It also bears out in some of our comparable community research. There are communities that have had very similar conversations to this about the difference between dispersed, or to use one of my favorite expressions I've heard in our interviews, industrial scale short-term renting versus owner-occupied short-term renting versus how some of our traditional lodge properties operate. And so, again, there's this approach, we believe, responds to our community circumstances, responds to, as best as we can, what we've heard from council and the public, and it's supported by some of the research that we've done. And so staff's recommendation, staff's recommendation on the permit types question is to go with 3 permit types as it supports the policy outcomes described in your memo.
Thank you. Just for council members, if you'll take a quick look at the slide that's up now, because I'm going to ask him to go back one slide for our comment period. So if you'll just take a look at what he's got there for you. And then if you'll, thanks. Skippy?
Yeah, a couple questions. On the audits, what specifically is meant, what does an audit encompass? Is it always the same every time?
A great question, and something that we need to flesh out once we get the direction this evening. I can speak in general terms that there are requirements that would be made for a lodging exempt property. They would have to meet some definition, and they would have to have some operational standards. And the audits may be targeted at ensuring that those operational standards and those requirements are met on an ongoing basis.
Got it. Okay.
So to put it another way, while Donnie's in the room, the Gantt, their operation's really static and really predictable. There may be some properties that meet the definition, but their operations and their ownership are a little less static and a little less predictable. And so the audits would be designed to ensure that there's ongoing compliance with baseline expectations.
Got it. So the audit is to make sure that they still fit into that category.
That's correct.
Which is separate from, say, the oversight of operational standards inside. Do you have CO2 and fair banisters?
Yep.
Different things.
This would be focused entirely on permitting compliance as opposed to life safety or Pete's audits, or Jim wants to audit somebody for their legal whatever is their, yeah, anyway, yes.
Okay, and those will apply to all types, all 3 buckets, those type of things?
Well, so that's a great distinction. No, not as conceived of here.
Okay.
So there would be annual permitting requirements for all 3 types. You'd have to renew your permit. The standards applied for a lodging exempt permit are different than the standards applied for an owner-occupied permit. And when we're reviewing an owner-occupied permit, we would be reviewing it for compliance with those standards. But that would just be a permit renewal. That's different than potentially having a lodging property fill out a form to attest, fill out an affidavit to attest to compliance with the standards that are relevant to a lodging exempt permit.
Okay, all right, so they would all have to meet the standard, but the standards could be different.
Absolutely, standards will be different.
Got it. And then the second line of questioning is just around the owner-occupied. Can you kind of expound on how staff came to the conclusion that a limited time frame was the appropriate balance?
Before you do that, though,
Sure.
I think there's other comments on this, and so I'd like you to hear those and then respond to that.
Absolutely, thank you.
Thank you. Sorry.
That's okay. That's my last question.
Okay. I'm going to share a couple thoughts that I have so that we can come back to that, and I'll start with owner-occupied STR. As we were envisioning this, for me, if somebody is a primary residence, I wasn't considering an annual duration limit, in the sense that if somebody is actually their primary residence, if they were to want to travel or get away for a year and they wanted to short-term it for that year but then return to their residency, the next year. So I was thinking of it in those terms. I didn't really think that if it was your primary residence and you just have one of those times that you want to get away, I wasn't thinking of an annual duration limit there. So I just want to share that.
Understood.
And then the second column, short-term rental, this was the one that was concerning me, is if it's a non-resident requirement and no annual limit, that didn't make sense. In certain units, I understand, but that's more of a zoning question than it is the ownership model. So my interest here, and the reason I bring this up is because, to me, that's part of what is driving the impacts that we're seeing in our community is non-residents buying properties for the sole reason of renting them out. So I question a little bit why that category is without annual limit for those properties. That was a little backwards to me, those two categories. On the lodging exempt STRs, I think I completely understand and have agreed from the beginning that we are looking at that sector of properties in a different light for many different reasons, front desks, on-site housekeeping, and the like. So I understand that one, but on the first two, I did have questions, and that kind of goes back to Skippy's question about the annual duration limit.
If I can just sort of go a level or two higher and just ask, do you support the 3-permit framework? The idea of making the distinction, details aside, making the distinction between the owner-occupied, the short-term, and the lodging exempt.
I appreciate you keeping the airplane up high. Yes, I think that is something that I anticipated there being delineation and differences in. So, yes.
Yes. If you're asking.
I am. Yeah, agreed.
Yeah, I'm a yes too, but I also have some questions about the requirements, or it's hard for me to say short-term rentals, not primary residence, unlimited, and also without knowing, is there a cap within the zone districts, or is this in every zone district possible? And things like that. So the details that are missing for me are the potential cap and attrition loss to get back to a certain number, and things like that. I just want to hear a little more of the logic behind some of the recommendations.
And we recognize, again, the interrelatedness of these things, and so
it's hard to separate.
I'm perfectly happy to take like the lump feedback, right?
Yeah.
The idea that you might favor 3 permits, but only 3 permits if there's a cap on a certain type, and these are the neighborhoods in which you'd favor a cap. We're here to receive all that input. So whatever order you'd like to provide that to us in, we welcome it.
Okay. Thank you for that. So everybody's understanding that he's still staying at a higher level. The question really is about different types of permits, just as a basic question.
Yep.
And then, but Skippy did have a direct question about that owner-occupied.
I'll just chime in. I agree with policy 1. I think that questions 2 through 6 and examples from what other communities are doing allow us to be very surgical on what we do and focused. So at the top of the funnel, yes, 3 categories.
Thank you.
All right, and then if we maybe just touch on Skippy's question.
Absolutely. So the question is about the owner occupancy limits and why. There's really 2 ways in which we have conceived of this. And the first is the way that we've proposed, and really the second, I think, is the way that the mayor articulated very well. Our proposal is in response to some policy priorities, and jump in here if I'm missing something. So policy priorities around the relationship between an owner-occupied residential unit as being a housing unit within the city. And the idea that a duration limit would ensure that owner-occupied unit remains a housing unit for the year in which it has a short-term rental permit. If you don't have a duration limit, then you would conceivably have a scenario like the mayor described, which is completely fine if that's the policy direction council favors. Staff had conceived of this as being about the relationship between that being a housing unit for a full-time resident, which is occasionally short-termed, and that duration limits were a policy response to that, or a regulatory response to that policy priority, right? On the inverse, why there would be no annual limit for the straight short-term rental, the non-owner occupied short-term rental, it's the inverse thinking. This is not a housing unit within our community. It's a lodging unit within our community, and so let's allow it to function as a lodging unit within our community. But we take the feedback very clearly that allowing flexibility to our owner occupants, to our full-time residents, and restricting the activity of our non-owner occupants delivers on other policy priorities. We absolutely get that, and communities have gone different ways on that question.
Can I just dig into that a little bit more? So do you have a sense of kind of the split? I recognize that, especially now, someone who it's their primary and only residence might say, hey, I'm going to go live in a Sprinter van for 5 years because I can go anywhere, right? I mean, I get that can happen. But at least from my perspective, what more often happens is this is your primary residence, and you can make enough to not do something else with it over the course of 4 weeks in some cases, but in many other cases you have a spare bedroom or you have a lock off or something like that, and so you may be there actually year round, but you want to be able to rent out that spare room, and so like this piece would make that challenging for people. So do we have a sense of which buckets we think people are really fitting in? Because that would inform how I think about the choice.
They fall into all the buckets.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, that's just the reality. We have enough units. There's enough diversity in our short-term rental stock and in our sort of approach to management and ownership that they fall into all the buckets.
Okay. And then the follow-up question, I talked about this, the last one, assuming that that's the right policy and the way to go, and that's what we want to do, my concern was that it's going to be very difficult to understand and enforce, and you're going to kind of check in other communities. So is there a workable, if not simple, answer to how we would actually bring that policy forward in an effective way if we chose it?
I mean, in terms of enforcement of duration limits?
Yeah.
Most communities don't do active enforcement on those types of regulations. It's the same with so many other things where we say this is how you can conduct this business in our community, and it's the honor system that people are in fact doing that. And the MuniRevs system and our tax remittance audit process allows us to ensure that we can compare tax filings and the permit application to that duration limit and get a sense of whether or not there might be some sort of violation on that. And that would again be part of a sort of an audit process, or could potentially be what we call complaint-based enforcement if we heard that a unit was being used more frequently than is permitted by the permit type.
Okay. I think I understand what I need to understand. Thanks.
Rachel?
Yeah, I have a feeling it's going to be a long work session.
Yeah.
A lot of good questions, but I actually get a little confused or lack the definition to know what do we mean by primary residence versus owner occupied. And what I've been hearing is that, well, it's owner occupied, I just don't really live there. It's my primary residence, but I'm gone all the time. Yeah. What really makes it an owner occupied unit? Just because it's not owned by an LLC or it's owned by an individual, or are they an owner-occupied unit if they are paying Colorado income tax? I've said it before in other venues, but local sales tax and local property tax are maybe half of what supports a guest vacation here, and it's your state income tax and that pay for all sorts of other things that we need to have a functioning airport and so on and so forth. So how do we really define that down? Do they have to have a bedroom that's locked off, that's theirs, that they're really there? Do they pay Colorado tax? How do we defining that?
Pitkin County has done some really good work on that specific question.
Yeah.
And we believe that their regulations are going to be very responsive to the sort of, I think, appropriate local conditions around that, as requiring tax filing and or this being your primary residence on your driver's license or your voting records, right? That they have a list of criteria. It's not physically sleeping in the unit
Okay,
however many days.
right.
And it was our plan to, and it remains our plan, unless we get direction otherwise, to coordinate with the county on where they land with that definition and to mirror that if council chooses to
Go
go
in that
this
direction.
direction.
Okay, thank you. That really helps me out a lot.
All right, so again, policy question number one, while there's details to be worked out, questions to be answered, ultimately the question is about a differentiation between different short-term rental types,
And
permit types.
And just a reminder, now that we have the direction on the 3 permit types, when we come back for the full regulatory review, those details that we've gotten some feedback tonight on and other things will be things that we can flesh out at that time. So this level of discussion this evening is perfect. Thank you.
Thank you.
Keep it high.
Yeah.
So question number 2, getting into discussion of caps. There are some assumptions baked into all these policy questions. So for example, this first question asks, if we're going to put a cap in place, this is assuming this would be on non-owner occupied permits. This is a response to, again, feedback from council and from the public and from our technical advisors about the relationship between the policy objective of having an owner-occupied permit. We covered some of that ground, that's appropriate. Those people live throughout our community in all different types of housing units. And so at that point, if we're entertaining caps and we would like to have an owner-occupant permit in place, staff's suggestion is that if council favors a cap, we're assuming that it would exclude owner-occupied permits. Those would be dispersed with no cap throughout the community, and the number of them would be regulated by the number of owner-occupants who want to short-term their home on an annual basis. And so with that assumption in mind, caps are a sort of tried and true method for limiting the extent and the intensity of impacts from short-term rentals, particularly in residential neighborhoods. The majority of communities, both in the report and other communities that didn't make the report that have caps, focus those caps on residential areas. Durango is a great example. They not only have caps, they have certain residential neighborhoods in which you can have a short-term rental, and there are caps within those neighborhoods. There are other neighborhoods shown in sort of white or not colored on the map where you can't have one at all. So that's just an example of how communities are using caps. The caps would deliver on some of council's stated policy objectives in terms of limiting density and intensity, controlling the number. But as was described in the memo, once you put in place a cap, it begs the question about size. And so how many permits under the cap? We'll skip the zone district question for a second because that's later. For just focusing on the number community-wide. If it's less than the number of short-term rentals than we have currently permitted in the community, that immediately begs the question about how we allocate those permits. And so that's, again, how we're going to move through the discussion for the next couple of items. But the question at this point is, does council favor a cap on non-owner occupied short-term rentals in residential zone districts? And staff's suggestion is that the most equitable way to hand out capped permits is grandfathering the existing permits. So that would then be the cap, however many there are in each residential zone district, creating a wait list, instituting non-transferability regulations to make sure that properties can't benefit from owner-to-owner maintenance of a short-term rental permit, and then having enforcement regulations in place as well to complement the cap. Open to discussion.
So, question for clarification: when you talk about residential zones, are you looking for the opportunity to create zone districts, or are you talking about using the language that's in some of our land use codes?
We would use current land use code zone districts.
So it would be R6 residential zones. It wouldn't be West End versus, it would be R6s, R15s, et cetera, et cetera.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Doing so is not only more straightforward from an administrative standpoint, it supports our legal defensibility in terms of the relationship between this being a land use and our using zoning powers to govern the land use.
Thank you. All right, council input, policy question number 2.
Yeah.
Done there, Skippy?
Bye, Phyllis. Yeah, I do support an overall cap. What I know you've said it begs the question, but it begs the question. And so, you know, I would want to focus in on that. I mean, I think, look, it's in the memo, right? Like, you memorializing the current ones is sort of a blunt force instrument, and maybe it helps move the process forwards, but is it even the number that we want for so many reasons? I don't know the answer to that. I mean, we got an email today just suggesting that, a number of the permits that we have in really aren't rented much, right? So we could set a number thinking it's the right number, but it turns out the use of those goes up dramatically, and we've set a number higher than we intended, and of course on the other side as well. So to me, the purpose of the overall cap is to preserve the lived and the tourist experience of our town. And I think ACRA's done some really great work recently of digging into this question of, management of the resort, the question of over tourism. So, can we identify that? Can we hone in on that and figure out, like, what is too much? At what point do we degrade the experience so much that it's a losing experience for everybody? And can we walk that number back to achieve our cap? Maybe we can do that before we pass this. Maybe that takes additional work, and that's sort of where that attrition piece comes in. But I think we need to be looking at that first. And then when it comes to the sort of sub-question about residential, we got to pull out the other stuff first. So if we say condo hotels, they're made for this, right? Once you have the cap, okay, well, that's up to there. And then if, taking care of locals is the next one, then it's there. And then that remainder is kind of what's left to divvy up amongst the residential zone districts. So that's sort of how I would think about it. And I don't know if it was clear in the last section. I do support the buckets, but I question the limit for owner occupied. I recognize it may be a problem, but I wouldn't go there first. And if there's a way to kind of see how those are being used, and then make changes if necessary, I just think if someone's going to benefit from the STR space, why not be locals? Sure. And when it comes to the type of STR product that I think is beneficial for the community, it is most that is affordable and intermeshed with community, which are kind of not always, but more likely to be those that are with owner occupied. Mm-hmm. They have a more vested interest in the experience.
Understood.
Skippy, I want to go back to something that you just said as you were kind of doing that calculation. I've had the same visual in my head. I believe before we went into putting a hold on 2022 STR permitting, we had about 1,200 in the few days where we were moving towards regulation. I think we got in about 200 or so. We're somewhere just above 1,400. Roundabout numbers that are kind of correct. Thank you, a shake of the hand there. And what you just said was you were kind of doing reverse math about condo hotels or this segment, and this question is very directly about residential zones. So this isn't an overall city cap. This is asking about residential zones.
Yeah, understood. And I do accept a cap in residential zones, but I think what that cap is has to follow from that bigger question to be. Yeah.
Thank you. All right, let's go around the table. Rachel?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I'm there for caps, and I would like to see the caps lower than the current number in these residential neighborhoods and come down to it through attrition and grandfather in existing permits. I think one of our commenters this evening really made the case of why this is a concern, is that homes will no longer be sold for a residential use or a residential value. They're being sold for what I can make off it as I turn it into a mini hotel. And I don't want that to be the sales dynamic in our community going forward. So my answer is yes. And, I got an email that came in, someone who said, I can't make tonight's meeting. Please understand how much harm short-term rentals do to residents like me. I bought my condo in 1985 when it was a quiet group. We now have 9 of 26 units rented out. 6 are short-term, 3 are long-term. Most weekends, we have many strangers in our area. 2 owners told me they're not my neighbor, they're investors. And I don't think we want to see our residential neighborhoods all turn solely into investors for the commercial activities and process. And as we've all said, you know, it's not just the demand in the unit, it's the demand in the town. So, yeah, I'm absolutely there. And I have one last little comment. You know, ACRA did start to deal with the over-tourism, and I've been away on vacation, so I've only read the papers a little spottily, that we're going to stop marketing the fall and the spring because of this over-tourism and the break we need. Well, when I got off the plane in the hotel zone in DIA, there were the 2021 ACRA folders in every brochure rack saying, come visit us in the spring and the fall. And so I realize they might not have new collateral out, but they're certainly still advertising, come here this fall and come here next spring, and out there promoting those time periods when we just simply can't handle this number of tourists anymore. So I was a little concerned that it didn't seem to jive with what I was hearing was a message from ACRA to the community.
My answer to the question number 2 is yes. And I'll give some reasons. I think grandfathering the existing permits is wise. Will mollify our local populace and make it possible for them to continue renting. I do think we should set a cap and non-transferability regulations and enforcement regulations. And I'd just like to say, I appreciated the map that showed all the STRs in town, and I think it's off a little bit because I noticed where my condo is, there aren't nearly as many short-term rentals there as what I am aware of. So I think there's a gap there. At any rate, again, my vote's yes.
More dots. I'm just going to go across the table, so I'll go next. I agree. I think this is part of the meat of what we're trying to get to, protecting residential zones and residents. I don't know where the cap should sit. I don't know how the cap should be derived. I don't know that we're even there yet. I don't know the answer to any of those, but I do feel like, yes, the residential zones, and this is one of the main thrusts of what we're trying to do, deserve some protections there. Again, I don't know if, we can say 20% of residences are able to be S-tier. I don't know where the cap or the threshold is. I want to dovetail a little bit on what Rachel just said, though. There were a couple of comments, and I wasn't going to respond, but in context here, I want to share. One of the speakers tonight was talking about how the operation is so wonderful because there will be a 3-day rental and then a cleaning service is there. That makes me think that there will be another 3-day rental and a cleaning service will be there. And that is one of the reasons that we're doing what we're doing. Those are the impacts that residential zones are experiencing. It's a greater volume of whether it's traffic, trash, visitors, usage, you name it. So I do agree with this. Again, I don't know where the cap sits. One thing that I've been thinking about here is something that we've all been saying is that when the financial model is what's driving the usage, valuation, and impacts, that's when our residents and the residential nature of our community is threatened most. So I keep that in mind as we're talking about all these kind of parameters and regulations. I'll head down this way.
My answer to question 2 is yes for caps, but I don't know that. I think one of the reasons that we're here is that we've felt, and the community has felt, that we're losing the fabric of our community. And I've heard a lot of people say you waited too long, but it's about time you do something about it. So I'm not convinced that everybody should be grandfathered in. I'm not convinced that the status quo is best for this community. In some zone districts, the cap might be right, and for some types of ownership, the caps are defined by the ownership and how we define those ownerships, but I'm just not comfortable saying that we have the right number now and we're going to decrease them through attrition. I agree with non-transferable, but I'm not. I don't feel comfortable that the number we have now isn't too high. So I do want to look at that, particularly in some of the zone districts. I generally feel that the further away from the core you get, the less the density. So as if an R6 might have more than an R15, and I understand that there are pockets of multifamily residential, but generally speaking, I think it should be kind of spread out. The further from the core, the less the number, and perhaps the larger the buffer. But I just think now that one of the reasons we're here is that the STRs are driving residential development, that it's become a commodity, that people have investors as neighbors, not people as neighbors. So I believe we should have caps, but I want to look more closely at what those caps are, and I think in some locations we might be above that cap.
Follow up from Skippy.
Can I just, sorry, I was going to say, I really agree with that, Ward, and maybe part of looking at grandfathering, is it a grandfather in perpetuity until you do sell, or is it a 5-year transition period, or there might be some variations on that theme? But I'd like to look at what.
Just respond to that specifically. That staff's proposal would be to grandfather and have non-transferability in place so that it's you have your permit until you sell your place or you abandon your permit.
Okay. That's your definition. I gotcha. Thank you for the clarification.
Yeah, I just, I wanted to second what Ward had said as well. Again, I don't know how we get there, but from a seat of the pants read, is it already too much certain times of the year? I think the answer is yes. And so I am definitely open to that conversation. Just for the public, and I know I'm probably speaking into a cave and no one's going to hear this anyways, but just so you understand, we're seeing the whole picture. What Rachel said is absolutely true. And we've heard this in comment after comment after comment, without the STR, I can't make my X, which means that the STR is determinately inflating the cost of that unit, which is a negative to our community. Maybe not to that owner, but to the community. It is also true, and we understand that that is not the only part of that equation, that if FTRs disappear tomorrow, which they will not, the investor profile is not going away, right? I mean, if you just sat on that unit with no income for the last 5 years, you're very much outpacing the stock market, and you have access to a community that you're very interested, where you can meet cool people. So it's not going away. But it is reorganizing that equation in a way that is incrementally better for the community, but it's not solving the problem, just so people understand that. And then the last thing is on the non-transferable, doesn't mean that there is, for somebody like Rick, notes. It doesn't mean that there can never be an STR again. That person can reapply under the rules, and if it fits the community's perspective at that time and rule set, then it could be. It's a question mark. So I just want to put that out there. It's not a guarantee that it can't, but yeah.
Thank you.
I'm clear on council's desire for a cap, and staff will, over the intervening weeks, put together what we think is a reasonable basis for a cap number.
Please.
The relationship between sort of tourism capacity and unit count is a bridge too far for us right now, but we can use zoning and land use concepts to provide some analysis to staff on different numbers that have what we believe will be, legal basis based upon planning practice. I've been asked to move to question 6 to respond to Mr. Strecker's desire to attend to some family matters, and so I'm going to try and do that.
Yes.
We're going to move straight to the tax question. If you want to, maybe if you just want to join us, I anticipate some discussion around this.
And we favor that expedited process for all these questions. Phil. Just so
Although we may not comply with our own desires.
somebody here
Ready to
is,
bring my family matters up more current?
I didn't say I was going to go back to number 3, just so we're all clear.
all right.
So again, should staff begin the process of developing a short-term rental specific tax for the 2022 ballot? We've had tax conversations before, so you understand Tabor and the relationship between that and timing. So I think maybe we can just have the discussion around the fact that a tax is to use a phrase from the Technical Advisory Committee, a sort of scalable response in terms of impacts to something that is clearly having impacts on our community. It could potentially generate revenue to not only mitigate those impacts, but to deliver upon related policy objectives of the community. It's just something that, again, because of Tabor, we have to be thoughtful about timing.
Yes.
Pete, did you want to add anything?
No, I mean, obviously, we've been talking with the advisory committee about taxes versus fees. What we've actually started off those conversations, we were kind of thinking that the fee approach would be, you know, the more straightforward approach. We actually heard quite the opposite from the steering committee. One of the reasons that Philip mentioned was that scalability was very important to them. The nuance to this obviously is fast-tracking a tax question is certainly a difficult one. And so that's why this is really important to kind of get some direction on as soon as possible with having to draft ballot questions and doing outreach and everything else. So we do think the fee issue is still still something we have to do for the operational costs. And I think we had overwhelming support for that as well. So it's not that we think there's only one or the other. I think we're going to have to do both. But again, that's up to the council if they want to go down the tax question.
On March 1st, we had discussed in this portion of the meeting, the financial portion of the meeting, the potential for an impact fee. And at that point, staff's consideration of that had been the relationship between residential development and short-term rental operation, and whether or not an impact fee was an appropriate thing to assess on that. And what we've, I think, arrived at with the stakeholder or the technical advisory committee, with our fee nexus consultants, and in discussions with the residential building side of the Moratorium project team, is that our affordable housing mitigation and impact mitigation approach to residential development is so robust and so responsive to that industry and to the dynamics that sort of around that industry, that an impact fee was not only not scalable, but it wasn't really a necessary tool because of the tools we have in place already. So staff's recommendation, or we're not recommending a tax, but if council wants to go this direction, we think some sort of lodging tax focused on short-term rentals is the right approach.
Thank you, guys. Policy question number 6. I'm going to start with Ward.
First of all, we don't have any fees. So if we were to institute fees, I think that should be for maintenance of the program, and I think that should also be scaled to the type of ownership and the impacts it has. And so what I see for taxes is for mitigation and impacts. So fees for maintenance, and to divide that up. But I think that we should look at taxes, because right now you pay $150 a year and you're home free, aside from the sales tax, lodging tax portion of it. So yes, I think that the impact on the community is not being mitigated. So I would favor a tax. I would like to see if we can scale that tax by the size of the units, so that if a 7-bedroom would be taxed at some rate, and a 2-bedroom and an owner-occupied might be a lot different tax.
It's usually based more on the actual cost for the room. So if you have a luxury offering, whether it's 1 room or 7 rooms, it scales up based on the cost of the room as opposed to the number of bedrooms.
We're in discussions with our Nexus consultants right now about the potential for a permit fee that responds to bedroom count or pillow count. So that's something that we're exploring.
Yeah, so I'm in favor of it. Obviously, it has to go to the voters, and so it has to be, I think, directly tied to the mitigation and the impact. And I would see it targeted for workforce housing.
And to the timing question, this is something you'd like Pete's team to look at for this year?
For the what? For the county? Put it on for this
November. Yeah,
November?
correct.
Yeah. Pete doesn't have anything else to do.
No,
He's got family issues, but other than that.
Except for
We
tonight.
don't have another budget coming up.
They'll be free after this evening. Let's go, John.
My answer is yes, and yeah, I think we should, just due to the wild disparity in fees for STR licenses across other communities, seems like we should do both.
Yes, I support asking the public for a fee, a tax to mitigate the impacts as we've been able to fully present those to the public. But the one thing I would throw up there is whether we want to think about March 23 city election as opposed to a November 2022 election. You know, part of it is how far along have you been able to get with polling and work and deciding the right amount and public opinion. But, you know, a lot of things kind of get lost in a big November ballot when you're dealing with state issues and state policies and governor races and, you know, Bobert race and all this stuff versus, you know, if it was in the March city election, which I believe we're allowed to have Tabor questions like a tax on because it's a regularly scheduled municipal activity, there'd be a real chance to focus on that and for the candidates to talk about why they believed it was necessary or not. And so it would help it be a little more of a clearly defining moment for our community. So that was the only thing I would think about. On the one hand, yes, I'd love to get the fees in as soon as possible if that's really what's happening. On the other hand, I know ballot questions take a little time to form, and I just wouldn't want to forget the potential of a March 23 election.
Skippy?
Yes, I support fees for operation, tax for impact. Yes, I would support going to 2022. I don't really have a problem with going to 2023, but my hope is that we may have sort of the next piece of this, which is the vacancy piece there, and maybe we would benefit from splitting those up. As far as where the tax goes, I agree with Ward, affordable housing. And I just want to, sort of the vision I hold in my head is that these STR and vacancy pieces can fund a program to reclaim our communities. To you said, like, this is the first sort of meaningful, hey, it's not an investment, and that's the second piece that sort of seals the cork that we put in. So I'm just mindful of that timing, but I would hope that this would be available for that type of program if we get there, and if not, then that's fine too. I just don't want to preclude it.
Yeah, you know, just for me, a small footnote, I would love to see this primarily for housing. That's the key impact we're seeing. But at the same time, we see other impacts with policing, particularly with over-tourism and some of the other community areas. So I you know, working on the language and its uses, I think would take a little more time. But I just want to put that footnote out there.
I thought you would, and I think that's appropriate also.
Thanks.
Yes, and I'm supportive of looking at the tax. I think Rachel had some good comments there. I'm 2022, 2023. Jim, in a tax question like this, if we were to go to the voters in November, and if it were to pass or fail, can you ask another related question in March or not?
I do not think there's any prohibition for putting it on the next election. I'm not aware of any prohibition for asking over and over. But clearly, March is allowed under Tabor, November is allowed under Tabor, and I'm just not aware of the inability to put it back on the ballot.
Okay.
We'll also bring back some timing information of our understanding of other tax questions happening here in the county.
Pete, do you have what you need?
I think so.
Okay.
Thank you.
Council, while we're on this fee and tax question, I just do want to bring to your attention that when you review, if you haven't yet, packet for tomorrow in the supplemental budget, we are asking for appropriation authority to kickstart some of this work. Just knowing that we have no capacity to really design and deliver this program on this moratorium timeline unless we start now getting some of the foundational pieces in. So just a heads up on what you're going to see tomorrow. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, Pete. All right,
As promised, I'll go back to
Back to
question
number
number three
three.
now. Yes.
Yes.
So back to caps, put your cap on. Oh, that was bad. If a cap below the existing number is instituted, how should non-owner occupied permits be allocated, by lottery or grandfathering and attrition? So we just heard council favoring a cap and favoring a cap somewhere below the existing number in residential zones. I think I heard from a majority that they favored grandfathering and attrition. Ward, I think, was very clear that he was not as firm in that belief, but just to make sure that what staff's hearing is accurate, that a majority favored grandfathering and attrition to arrive at the cap number.
is that their actual mapping?
Yes.
They're also not mutually exclusive. I mean, they are as maybe a starting policy, but they would end up potentially living together.
A lottery and a grandfathering and attrition.
Yeah, if you
system.
set a cap and grandfathered and did attrition, once you got down to the cap, you'd have to allocate the ones that become available. You'd use lottery.
That's correct. Did you, in your research, find any communities that used a lottery instead of a linear wait list after a cap was instituted?
No, most of the communities have a wait list based on when they've come in, and they have it based on priority of when their application was received.
I think you get into a sort of fairness or equity question in terms of keeping that wait list, and somebody who may have been waiting for waiting for an available permit for a long time versus somebody who just purchased a property and got on the wait list. And if you're running a lottery at that point, is that a fair way to allocate?
Yeah,
permits?
yes, that makes sense. And the question becomes, I mean, that's sort of, it presupposes that when that person then gets that permit, they have it forever until they sell, which may or may not be the case. It may make more sense to say, hey, you get 2 years and then you go back into the lottery so that, everyone has their opportunity to do this on a short term. I can't point to a community that's done that, but in conversations I've heard that come up as things communities have done. Maybe, maybe not. I don't have an answer on which one's better, but just to put it out there.
A system where we're constantly running a lottery is very administration heavy.
Sure.
It's something we can respond to. I struggle to think of a stated policy objective of council at this point that would be supported by a lottery system like that.
Yeah.
But
My concern on that, Skippy, would be that you would have people who would still consider it investment property as opposed to residential, and be in a position, as you've talked about, with potential appreciation of the property alone, to just wait it out until they can get in the next lottery, and then you're reestablishing more rent, you're reestablishing that value as a hotel as opposed to property. And I certainly agree with the equity argument of people who've been on a wait list for a while, and now one's come up, but the new guy who just bought the place is able to be in the same lottery with someone who's been waiting for a permit and may have lived here for a long time. I don't think that's appropriate.
That raises a question for me, and I think the answer's clear, but just to be clear, when we're in our bucket of owner-occupied, we're only talking about that unit they occupy. So if your primary residence is in Aspen, but you have a second place, that does not count in that bucket, right? That becomes a short-term rental, right?
that's correct.
Just want to make sure. Because that would
Good question.
change that equation a lot. Just wait it out until and then move to the next one.
I guess when I read this, I'm wondering about those different classifications and zones as it relates to this. Because an overall cap and limitation, I'm not in that camp. I see properties and zones that are traditionally used in this way. et cetera. So I am, I appreciate staff recommendations. I'm gonna just kind of sit there. Grandfathering existing, no reduction in total existing. I don't know that I don't know what our number is now, whether it's too many or too little. I don't know. Along with the email that we received today saying that some 200 of them are inactive. Truly, a bunch of people did get permitting just in case. They said, I don't have any plans to short-term rent, but I'm just going to get it in case. So we saw a couple of those come through. So I'm just a little gray on this. I don't have any real hard direction for myself, but I do appreciate staff's recommendations at the bottom.
Can I ask one more question?
Yep.
Sorry, they just triggering a bunch of questions for me. But assuming that in the condo, hotel, the lodging zone, it's sort of by right, and I recognize that there's not a ton of free market developments that are getting bigger these days, but who knows in the future if the Gantt gets redeveloped and by right it can be twice as big, are we also then saying that we can have twice, assuming the square footage per unit stays the same, are we guaranteeing that we could have twice as many on that parcel with the kind of approach we're taking?
Well, the Gantt, the redeveloped Gantt would first have to be a condo hotel. It would have to be a lodge property. And if that's the case, then they would be lodging exempt. So yes.
Okay.
If it's redeveloped as a multifamily property, we're getting kicked into multifamily replacement, and that's another work session.
Okay, cool. And just to clarify,
Sorry.
that's not because the Gantt is doing or planning or hinting at anything. Donnie's just in the audience. He was in my eyes, so I used him as an example. I'm very sorry.
He's used to that.
Happens to me all the time.
Can't get used often. Okay, let's get some more input on policy question 3. I'll go to John and then Ward.
I am also a yes, and I agree with what Tori said. I'm going to go with staff recommendation, but Ward did bring up the fact and my comments about not enough dots. I'm not comfortable with capping something that we don't actually know the true number of what it is. So anyway, I'll go with staff recommendations. Thanks.
Yeah, if our cap is below what the existing number is, it could take years before we get to a place where we're at a level that is right. So, and the staff recommendation is don't decrease anything now. If we do you want to do a lottery? And so I'm running these through my head. If you do a lottery, is it once and done? You don't have a chance to get it again? Is the lottery good for a couple of years? Is there something in between? If you win a vacation rental permit or an STR and you don't use it, do you lose it? And what would be the cutoff at the certificate of occupancy or building permit? Does somebody that builds something new have a STR by right? Are we capping it that new development does not by right have an STR? I don't know how long it takes to get down. I thought I saw Haley say that in some towns it got down in a few years. It could take 10 years. If we're above what we want now, do we want to tolerate 10 years? I'm more in Tori's. I'm not sure that what the answer is, but I think that in some places we're above what we want to be, and I don't know if we want to wait for attrition and non-renewables or transferables. So I have the questions, I don't have the answer.
That's very understandable. There's a lot of hypotheticals here. The way staff has conceived of the lottery system working is the lottery would be run once, and then we would lean on attrition to allocate abandoned or revoked permits after the lottery had been conducted.
And abandoned would be use it or lose it?
Well, yes, that's correct.
Or sold properties.
Sold properties, use it or lose it, or enforcement. And staff, I think, is prepared at the next work session to propose an enforcement regime similar to Crested Buttes, which they have a 3 strikes and you're out policy, where if you have 3 enforcement actions filed against you, your permit's revoked.
Yeah, I mean, we're here because we feel the pressure on the community, so I really have reservations about waiting years to get to a number where it's acceptable.
Understood.
Board's raised another question for me. Under staff recommendation, if a STR, let's call it the middle bucket, doesn't really matter though, if it is not sold, if there's not a sale of that, but the owner changes the title on it, so they move it to an LLC, there's a transfer of ownership deed without a sale, do they also lose their? They do, okay.
You want to respond to that?
No, yes is a perfectly acceptable answer.
Yeah, I mean, that's how most other cities are doing it.
I support that, I just wanted to make sure, because you could drive 3 Mack trucks through that loophole.
We are, I think part of staff's recommendation is going to include standards around what constitutes a qualified owner or owner's representative.
Okay.
And maybe Skippy is certainly a qualified owner, Skippy Mesero, right? And you signed your permit
Did I
application.
buy a house? That's awesome. Someone gotta tell me
Congratulations.
about it. Thank you.
But beyond that, who else can be a permit holder for a piece of property? And some really, really bright lines around that are necessary, and we're developing that framework.
Cool.
And the scenario you described, it sounds like, would not meet that standard.
Yeah, good.
Okay, thank you for the clarity on that. Policy question 4, if a cap is established, should we exempt commercial, mixed use, and lodging zones from the cap? This is, again, response to feedback from the Technical Advisory Committee, from the public, about the relationship between short-term rentals, our tourist, our sort of lodging economy, or our lodging bed base to support our tourist economy, and where short-term rentals might be located in town. Close to transit, close to goods and services, close to traditional lodging. The suggestion is that if they are in one of these zones, they are close to those things, and that is an appropriate place for a higher concentration of short-term rentals. It is an appropriate place for short-term rentals to exist and to operate. And by the zoning code, short-term rentals in those locations are going to be smaller, which gets to another thing we've heard from council and from our engagement, is that there's a degree to which short-term rentals diversify the lodging product that's available in our community by size and therefore by price point, and that has value for our tourist economy and it has value for our lodging bed base. And so there are examples of these types of exemptions in other communities that are thoughtful about short-term rentals, and so staff's recommendation is to exempt them from caps. This would not exempt them from permitting, and it would not exempt them from the 3 categories of permitting. So the 3 categories would still apply in these zone districts. All of the standards associated with permits would still apply in these zone districts. The only difference is that if caps are instituted in response to the community impacts that we have discussed as a group around short-term rentals in residential neighborhoods, that dynamic is different in these neighborhoods, and that's the genesis of staff's recommendation on this topic.
I'll lead this off, yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, not so simple to me. I recognize the value in having non-capped areas and having concentration of product in there for all the reasons you said, as well as, you know, what some of our public comments said, which is like, if every owner in that building has agreed this is what we do, well, then you concentrate that use. It makes sense. You have similar interactions across. So I see the validity in carving out areas. I question if these are the right ones, or if we need all of these. Certainly, you know, mixed use is an area we hope to have more affordable housing and more work live in. We talked about that during the moratorium and other places. Is that compatible with, you know, not by right, but unlimited STRs? I'm not so sure that it is. You know, I live in a building currently that would be within that lodging zone district, Fifth Avenue condos, and when the owner who rents it to me moved in there, 100% of those were full-time locals. There's 3 of us in those multiple buildings now. That doesn't feel like a good outcome. Maybe the lodge zone is the right one for that exemption. It is pushed up against the mountain, but I've long questioned, is the lodge zone really the lodge zone anyways? You don't have to be a lodge in it. It's sort of amorphous. So I would agree that some carve out of sort of STR by right zone makes sense, but I question if this is the right border to it. And I'm not sure if we have to pick an existing zone and stick to it, or if we can sort of draw our own. Durango had that central corridor. You know, Chattanooga, where I have one, has one by right, and the rest is very difficult. I think that works. So, yeah, conceptually, sure, but I question the borders.
Yep. And I agree. I had the same question. I didn't know if it was really a commercial zone overlay or if it was by STR permit type. I agree. My initial reaction is yes, because it's traditional lodging, but I think there's a finer tooth comb maybe that's utilized to get at what we're trying to get to.
So staff is using sort of our existing zone district boundaries as the basis for this, again, for the reasons I discussed a little while ago, that in terms of the sort of defensibility of the regulations, having them tied, because it's a land use, having them tied to our zone districts and our policing powers under the zoning code provides us with the sort of greatest protection there. And Durango was brought up as an example. They use their zone districts in that way. Buffers can be appropriate, but once we're talking about buffers, then we're back into the caps conversation, and so the exemption thing gets a little lost. And so I guess specifically, are there zone districts, and this gets to the RMF question we're about to discuss. Skippy brought up, Councilmember Mesro brought up mixed
Skippy
use.
works better for me.
Are there additional zone districts that maybe council's unsure about with respect to an exemption?
If we have to pick an existing zone district, lodging to me makes the most sense, followed by commercial. I very much question mixed use. And lodging, we rezone stuff all the time for all different reasons. So just because we pick lodging now doesn't mean that over time we can't amend it to where we want it to go.
That's correct.
Thank you.
I'll admit to getting a little confused on this one because it's hard to kind of visualize everything you might be saying yes to in commercial or yes to in mixed use. And so that's a challenge for me there. But what I was thinking is certainly agreeing with what Skippy and Ward have said about the lodging zone district, absolutely. And it makes me wonder whether some of those other zone districts may be appropriate via a special review. Because if they were, by chance, a condo hotel in the mixed zone district, or, other factors that related to it, but I just have a hard time with it as a blanket statement. I guess I'm thinking of all the things in the mixed use zone district that could we start to see office spaces being turned into rental units on the second floor of a building because they have a bathroom down the hall? I just kind of wonder what does that mean? Sure. And so I'd need more detail there. But I have some hesitancy on the other zone districts. But I also, I think there could be, like I was saying, a special review or a series of criteria created that would help us understand and potentially narrow that funnel a little bit.
Understood.
Same camp.
Yes, and I agree.
Yeah.
With the previous comments?
Yep.
Exactly.
Thank you. Last question this evening. The residential multifamily zone district. How should short-term rentals in the RMF be regulated? This is one that's unique for us in terms of the relationship between sort of existing development pattern in a zone district, how it's zoned, what the allowed uses are, and the underlying dimensional allowances for development are, and how short-term rentals are treated. So without a specific comparable, our analysis I think is really focused on the policy outcome that we're going for. Does council conceive of the residential multifamily zone district, as was described in the memo, as being an opportunity for housing, current housing and future housing? Or is the residential multifamily zone district an opportunity to focus on lodging, diversify our lodging to bed base, and permit more short-term rentals as a result of that. Staff's recommendation is to conceive of it as a neighborhood and to cap the existing number of short-term rentals and regulate it like other residential zone districts. Obviously, with the lodging exempt permit as one of the options, that gives us some granularity or some flexibility in terms of how we respond to the existing condition in that neighborhood in terms of the presence of the Aspen Alps in particular, but open to council discussion on this last topic.
You have thoughts?
Yeah, the first letter in RMF stands for residential, and so that's where I would start. I recognize that it's interspersed into what feels like the core of our community, but we're trying to make residential again. This is a great place to do it. I think many of these are great sites for, development neutral redevelopment projects where the neighborhood can more contextually accept density or other projects. So I would agree with your recommendation.
John?
My answer is yes. And again, as we've heard earlier tonight, we're seeing people specifically buying properties if they can be used as an STR. So I support this. I think we should cap the STRs in residential multifamily. Thanks.
Rachel?
Yeah, I'm there as well. I noticed that the other couple of little symbols aren't under the staff recommendation in terms of attrition to reduce or, enforcement activities. And so would we see this cap as existing number of STRs and potentially a declining cap over time?
The second bullet is meant to suggest that we
All
would
the
treat
other-
this like the previous discussions we've had this evening. And the council consensus was grandfather the existing permits and establish some cap below the existing permit number, and we would treat this zone district the same way.
Okay, that's what I wanted to get. So the cap would be the existing number and see it reduced through attrition.
Correct.
I agree with that. I think, especially when we look at the potential of redevelopment of some of those much older complexes, that is, it shouldn't just turn into a hotel zone. So there's that. Thank you.
I'll support staff recommendation. I think this is primarily just a little bit east of the core, isn't it?
That's correct.
Yeah.
Original to the river and Hopkins to Cooper, or Hopkins to Durant.
And they're about a 4-block area over by West Hyman Avenue.
Yeah, there's the boundary moves around a little bit.
Yeah,
yes.
I support staff recommendation.
Same.
That wasn't as bad as I thought time-wise. I think we're pretty expeditious.
Are there any additional discussions or ideas that council has on the topics we discussed this evening or that we didn't discuss this evening that you'd like to suggest to us? Because again, the next time we are in front of you on this topic, we'll be presenting a complete regulatory framework for your review prior to going to ordinance.
I have a comment. The amount of public engagement and outreach, I think, is commendable. I think that you've done a great job of reaching out, and I know a few years ago, council was accused of not having enough communications, and now we get chastised if the public outreach doesn't agree with what somebody wants as a result. But I think, I just want to chapeau to you and staff.
Thank you.
Comments?
Yeah. I don't know that I have this well formulated to express, but really having just come back from this vacation and spent a little time on the island of Cozumel and then Cancun, and listen to our tour guide when we were going to see the great archaeological site say, do you guys realize that Cancun was just an island in 1972 with a fishing village and 400 people, and you look at the hotel zone and everything it is now, and their problems are coming along, housing, workforce, the same old things, you know. But it just struck me that we were so deliberately a slow growth community. And I don't know that that message of why we've made so many choices for so many years resonate or they're understood by our greater population now. That had we just not had those brakes on all the time for the past 40 or 50 years, this would be Vail. This would be Vail plus. You know, and that these choices, whether it's an urban growth boundary or supporting mass transit or some of the zoning that we have, has built something to withstand the pressures of industrial tourism. And the goal that stood out, I think, that Aspen has had and at some level and has achieved during that same time period of growth pressures was to have a sustainable living community in the town, not exported to 40 miles away who comes in and out every night. And listening to some of the locals on the island of Cozumel and their fears for what's happening there, that they don't want to become a community where the whole workforce comes in on the ferry in the morning and goes home at night, and there's nothing there. And that's what we've been battling, and that's what we're up against. But those pressures are endless, and they never end. And I am proud to serve with this council and past councils that have tried to maintain some goals other than pure economic development at whatever cost. And I think that, oddly enough, going the opposite direction has created far more economic development and reward for the community than it could have imagined. That's all. Thank you.
Thanks, Rachel. Other comments?
Yeah, I appreciate that, Rachel. You know, I guess this is more just to say out loud, but, you know, the guarantee that this will always be simply financially beneficial, I don't think is a sure thing. People come here for a reason. There's a town not so far from here that has just as good of scenery called Ashcroft, and not super high real estate values because we made different choices in those two parcels. And you know what Phyllis said today about sort of the sadness of what's happening in town, I feel that acutely. A lot of people do. The people coming to me most recently questioning whether they can remain here are not the people like me kind of just barely getting by financially and finding a way to make it work. It's people that own $5 and $8 and $10 and $12 million homes who moved here to retire or participate in the community because they love it, and they're going, well, if the people that we love aren't here, we can afford to go anywhere else. So, you know, just it's within that context. I thank you for saying that. The only thing I wanted to add, just for notes, guys, is I don't think any of us, certainly I don't expect to end at a perfect outcome. I don't expect for whatever rules come down to benefit everyone or harm no one. That's just not reality. To make real change, you know, unfortunately, it will be disadvantageous to some. I recognize you said, you know, in terms of the cap, like we're not going to get this perfect off the first jump. We may not be able to do the deep dive. That's okay. That's an imperfection that we can have, but what we owe the community, what I feel I owe the community, is strong conviction as to why and how we have arrived at that imperfect solution, how we plan to improve it going forwards. And so I anticipate, I ask for staff to come to us with that full, complete story. You know, how did we arrive at this imperfect but beneficial policy so that we can explain it to those who might not benefit in the immediate but have conviction in this will ultimately be better for everyone in the town in the future.
Thanks, Skippy. I only have a few things to add. With what Rachel said, we would be a lot like Vail, but with better skiing. And to what Skippy said is, I completely agree. I was sharing those thoughts with Sarah earlier today about every step that we're taking forward here is a positive step. I don't expect this to be perfect, but I really think that what we've done here and taking this issue on for the betterment of our community is a great step forward. And I know that a lot of people have their fears. Tonight we heard from Rick, who was very concerned and saying that he's having trouble in different areas. And I think some of it is unfounded. The goal here is for a better future and a better future for our community. It's not about limitations or taking anything away. But so I also want to just say thank you. You guys have done a great job. Talk about a big, hairy, messy one. This is one of them. But again, your approach on it, your information that you're providing with us, the alternatives, the questions that you're asking, staying up here with us, and then doing the hard work that you're doing, just nothing but compliments to you and how you're handling not only this, but a lot that's going on in the department. So to you and to your staff and your team, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Appreciate you.
I also just want to say thank you to our remaining audience members. Can't say what anyone else who left did. Maybe they went and watched it and listened to it, give them the benefit of the doubt. But I think when people say they're interested in the policy and they show up and actually stay for the conversation and listen, it demonstrates that, and I appreciate that.
Thank you, guys. Is that everything then?
That's it from us. Thank you very much, Mayor.
That's our work session agenda for this evening. We are back tomorrow night, Tuesday, the 12th. We have a regularly scheduled meeting, which means that public comment is taken sometime shortly after 5 p.m. Join us then if you have comments for council. Thank you, guys. Thank you. Thank you, Grassroots.